the Stone Age. It sounds straightforward enough. Rocks, caves, spears, people grunting at each other until someone figures out fire. But in reality, it's not one neat period you can summarize in a sentence. It's a vast stretch of human history that lasted for millions of years. If history were a movie series, the Stone Age would be Season 1, Episodes 1 through about 40. All before we even get to metalworking. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why some Stone Age artifacts make absolutely no sense, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Historians divide it into 3 main episodes, although archaeologists prefer the term periods because they have a thing about sounding serious. Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. This is the really old one, starting roughly 2.5 million years ago, when our ancestors were making crude tools out of flint, scavenging carcasses, and trying not to get eaten by things with far too many teeth. Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. Think of it as the awkward teenage years of human civilization. People are experimenting with new tools, learning to fish better, and slowly figuring out that settling down might be smarter than chasing mammoths across Europe. Neolithic, the New Stone Age. This is where things get exciting. Farming, pottery, permanent settlements, and finally, houses that weren't just rocks with an attitude. Now, here's where the confusion part comes in. You'd think that after millions of years we'd have the Stone Age figured out, but the truth is, archaeologists keep digging up objects that defy explanation. Some are so strange they look like the product of a prehistoric prank, like someone 20,000 years ago decided, this will really mess with people in the future. It's important to understand the problem. The Stone Age didn't leave us instruction manuals. If ancient people made something, we can't exactly ask them what it was for. We can only guess. And guessing in archaeology comes with the polite academic version of wrestling matches. Scholars publishing papers that subtly, or not so subtly, call each other wrong, all while trying to prove their interpretation is the best one. Imagine walking into a stranger's house, seeing an object you've never seen before, say a Roomba, and trying to guess what it's for. Without context, you might decide it's a ceremonial offering bowl, or a rolling altar for tiny gods. Now imagine doing that, but the house is 10,000 years old, the Roomba is a lump of carved bone, and you have no idea what language they spoke, what they ate, or what they thought about the stars. That's archaeology in a nutshell. And the funny thing is, this problem will never go away. Even in our modern world, future historians could easily misunderstand us. Picture someone in the year 5225 digging up your air fryer and confidently declaring it a ceremonial bread shrine used in complex religious rituals, or your smartphone being labeled an elite communication tablet used for inter-village diplomacy, ignoring the fact that 99% of its use was watching cat videos. But here's what makes the Stone Age especially mind-boggling. It's long enough that human culture changed many times, yet still left only bits and pieces behind. Sometimes we find a spearhead, sometimes a carved figurine, sometimes a series of scratches on a cave wall that could be art, or could just be someone absent-mindedly doodling while waiting for dinner. This is also why the Stone Age is so much fun for historians and storytellers alike. It's part detective work, part creative imagination. We know enough to be fascinated, but not enough to be sure, which means every strange object from this era could have multiple explanations, ranging from totally reasonable to what on earth were they thinking. Another twist. Many Stone Age artifacts weren't meant to last. Most everyday objects, baskets, clothing, wooden tools have rotted away. What we find today are the stubborn survivors: stone, bone, ivory, and in rare cases preserved wood or cave paintings. So our picture of Stone Age life is like trying to understand a modern kitchen by only looking at the toaster and the fridge magnets. And sometimes what survives is misleading. An elaborately carved stone ball might look ceremonial, but maybe it was just a game piece. A carved animal on a bone could be a sacred symbol, Or maybe it's just an early example of someone sketching the wildlife out of boredom. Without the full context, we're left piecing together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and the few pieces we do have might belong to a completely different puzzle. Yet that's the charm of the Stone Age's strangest artifacts. They force us to think about our ancestors not as generic cavemen, but as real people with their own creativity, quirks, and inside jokes. People who lived, laughed, got frustrated, and apparently made objects that would one day baffle the future. In this video, we'll look at some of the most confusing Stone Age finds, from figurines that might be goddesses or just bad sculpture, to musical instruments that suggest humans have always loved annoying each other with noise. But for now, just remember, the Stone Age wasn't just people with rocks. It was an age of experimentation, imagination, and if these baffling objects are anything to go by, an occasional love for making things that make absolutely no sense. If you could travel back in time to the Stone Age and peek inside someone's home, and by home we mean a hut made of animal hides, bones, and the occasional mammoth skull, you might spot something unexpected: a tiny carved figurine of a woman. No face, no feet, but extremely committed to, let's say, certain physical features. These are the Venus figurines, small prehistoric statues of women found scattered across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, dating anywhere from about 40,000 to 14,000 years ago. The most famous, the Venus of Willendorf, was discovered in Austria in 1908, is just 4 inches tall, and has been inspiring archaeological arguments ever since. At first glance they seem almost cartoonish: large breasts, rounded bellies, wide hips, and often no clear facial details. This wasn't Stone Age realism, it was Stone Age exaggeration. The kind of exaggeration that makes you think either this was deeply symbolic, or someone's artistic skills just weren't ready for human portraits yet. Now the first question people ask is, why make them at all? After all, these figurines took time to carve from stone, bone, or ivory, and life in the Ice Age didn't exactly leave much free time between don't starve and don't freeze. Archaeologists have offered several theories, none of which have unanimous agreement because agreeing would be too easy. Theory 1. Fertility symbols. The most popular explanation is that these figurines represented fertility, not just in the sense of childbirth, but the abundance of life itself. The emphasis on reproductive features could symbolize survival in a harsh, resource-scarce world. In other words, more babies, more hunters, more gatherers, and a better chance your group didn't end up as saber-toothed tiger snacks. Theory 2. Ice Age ideal beauty. Some suggest these figurines reflected the ideal female body type of the time, a celebration of body fat, as a sign of health and survival. In a world where winter could kill you, having extra body fat was as desirable as owning a luxury car today. This means that yes, the Stone Age beauty standard was basically, can you survive 3 winters in a row without fainting? Theory 3. Portable goddesses. Other researchers believe they could be representations of deities, early goddesses of life, earth, or protection. They could have been carried during travels as talismans or placed in special locations as offerings. Think of it as prehistoric pocket-sized religion. Theory 4. Self-portraits. This one is more recent and slightly hilarious. The idea that these could be self-portraits carved by women without mirrors. If you look down at yourself, certain parts will appear larger in proportion, especially if you're wearing layers of mammoth fur, which means the Venus of Willendorf might actually be the oldest example of draw what you see. Theory 5. Ice Age Barbie. Alright, not a real theory in the academic world, but it's hard not to joke that these could have been some form of toys, teaching tools, or just decorative keepsakes. After all, humans have always made art for fun as much as for function, and if you can whittle a spear, you can whittle, well, whatever this is. The craftsmanship of these figurines is worth noting. Some are incredibly detailed, with etched hair patterns, carefully smoothed surfaces, and proportions that, while stylized, show a deep familiarity with the human form. Others look like they were made by someone who was trying carving for the first time and decided, close enough, I'm done. And then there's the curious fact that these figurines pop up in many different places across thousands of miles, from France's Venus of Lesbos to Kostenki Venus. They appear in diverse regions with slightly different styles but the same general idea. This suggests the concept was shared widely, either through trade, migration, or the Stone Age version of cultural trends, basically prehistoric Pinterest. One detail that often surprises people: the figurines aren't all found in living spaces. Some are discovered buried in unusual locations, deep in caves, or deliberately placed in the ground. This has led some archaeologists to think they were part of rituals, maybe even buried as offerings for good hunting, healthy births, or safe journeys. Others, however, believe they were simply lost items, dropped by travelers who didn't realize they'd just created an archaeological headache for someone 25,000 years later. The mystery deepens when you realize how long they were made. This wasn't a fad that lasted a single generation. Venus figurines were produced for tens of thousands of years. That's like a cultural tradition stretching from ancient Egypt all the way to today without losing popularity. Whatever they were for, they clearly mattered. But here's where the absolutely no sense part comes in. We can't know for sure what they meant. Were they sacred, playful, aspirational, practical, without written records? The truth is locked away in the minds of the long-gone people who made them. And maybe that's the point. They don't have to make sense to us. They made sense to them. Still, the ambiguity is half the fun. These figurines are a reminder that Stone Age humans weren't just grunting hunters. They were artists, storytellers, and maybe even jokers. Somewhere 25,000 years ago, someone carved a Venus figurine and proudly showed it to their friends. Whether those friends gasped in reverence or burst out laughing, well, we'll never know. One thing's certain: the Venus figurines are one of the most enduring mysteries of prehistory. They're beautiful, strange, and endlessly debatable, and they prove that even in the harshest conditions, humans have always had time for art, and for making things that leave future archaeologists scratching their heads. Or, to put it another way, they're either a prehistoric symbol of life and beauty, or the world's first really bad attempt at 3D printing. When you think of the Stone Age, you probably picture tools, sharp, functional, survival-ready instruments for chopping wood, skinning animals, or defending yourself from something with claws. After all, tools were the original human superpower. We couldn't outrun a cheetah, outclimb a bear, or outbite anything, really. But we could make a pointy rock, and then sometimes we made pointy rocks that, well, weren't actually useful at all. One of archaeology's favorite head-scratchers is the Acheulean hand axe. These have been found across Africa, Europe, and Asia, dating as far back as 1.7 million years ago. Most Acheulean hand axes are exactly what you'd expect: teardrop-shaped, sharp-edged, made for cutting and scraping. But then there's the odd group, the ones that are too big, too heavy, or so finely polished they'd make a terrible but very pretty weapon. Imagine you're a Stone Age hunter, and you need to butcher a deer. You reach into your toolkit and pull out something the size of a dinner plate, weighing as much as a newborn. Congratulations, you've chosen the prehistoric equivalent of trying to slice bread with a bowling ball. This raises the question: why make a tool that doesn't actually work as a tool? Archaeologists have floated a few theories. Theory 1: status symbols. Some believe these oversized or over-decorated hand axes were never meant for work. Instead, they might have been the Stone Age equivalent of a Rolex, an item you flaunt to show you have the time, resources, and skill to make something extravagant. Look at this perfect, symmetrical, utterly useless axe. You could say at the campfire, I made it in my spare time while you were still chasing rabbits. Theory 2: ritual or ceremonial objects. Another idea is that these hand axes had spiritual or ceremonial roles. They might have been used in special events, offerings, or rites of passage. Picture a young hunter being handed one as a symbol of adulthood, then immediately thinking, great, now what do I do with this giant rock? Theory 3: skill demonstrations. It's possible some of these were portfolio pieces, made by expert flint knappers to showcase their mastery. Much like an artist hanging a painting on the wall, A Stone Age craftsman might have kept an oversized, flawless axe to prove their worth in the tool-making department. Theory 4. Trade and gifts. A beautifully made, impractical hand axe could have been a valuable trade item or a prestige gift. After all, in a world without currency, a finely crafted object was a form of wealth, and nothing says "I value our friendship" like handing over an axe they'll never actually use. But the strange tool phenomenon isn't limited to giant axes. Across different Stone Age cultures, archaeologists have found flint shapes so bizarre they've been dubbed mystery objects. Some are round, some are pointed in odd directions, and some are so thin they'd snap if you tried to use them. One particularly baffling type is the giant core, a huge chunk of flint that looks like the starting block for making tools but is left unused. It's as if someone started the job, got halfway, and decided, you know what, this would look great just like this. Were they half-finished mistakes, ritual items, or just prehistoric home decor? And then there are microliths, tiny flint pieces only a couple of centimeters long. Sure, some were parts of composite tools, but others are so minuscule it's hard to imagine what they were for. Cutting fairy bread? Performing prehistoric eyebrow grooming? We simply don't know. The funniest part is watching how archaeologists describe these finds in academic papers. They'll use phrases like possible symbolic significance or likely a prestige item, which is the polite academic way of saying, we have no idea, but we're going to sound smart about it. There's also the possibility, and some scholars whisper this like it's forbidden, that some of these mystery tools were just mistakes. Maybe not every Stone Age artisan was a genius. Imagine a young apprentice napper trying to impress the elders, making something completely unusable and then burying it so no one could find it. Unfortunately for them, we found it. And who knows, some of these might have been made purely for fun. Humans like to make things, not always for a purpose, but because it's satisfying. In a world without Netflix, maybe shaping a perfect but impractical axe was the ultimate weekend project. What's certain is that these impractical tools challenge our assumptions about prehistoric life. They remind us that early humans weren't purely focused on survival. They had time for beauty, status, pride, and maybe even showing off. Not every object had to be functional. Some could simply be impressive. So next time you see a sleek, oversized Acheulean hand axe in a museum display, remember, you're not just looking at a tool, you're looking at a Stone Age flex. Because nothing says I'm important like lugging around a rock you can't actually use. Some mysteries come in the form of riddles, others in dusty manuscripts, and then there's the Shigir Idol, a towering 11,500-year-old wooden statue dug out of the Siberian earth that has left archaeologists collectively scratching their heads. Discovered in 1890 by gold miners in Ural Mountains, this prehistoric oddity is both astonishing and baffling. A carved, human-shaped figure standing more than 5 meters tall in its original form, etched with intricate geometric patterns, zigzags, and symbols that seem to be trying very hard to tell us something, but in a language no one has spoken for 10 millennia. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding an ancient USB stick without the right operating system to open it. The Shigir Idol's story begins not in a pristine museum but in a waterlogged peat bog, which incidentally is the reason it survived at all. Wood usually rots away long before the millennia mark, but the bog preserved it like nature's own freezer. When the miners struck it during their dig, they probably thought they'd found a giant creepy totem pole from some long-forgotten tribe. Little did they know it would turn out to be the world's oldest known wooden sculpture, outdating the Egyptian pyramids by a solid 7,000 years. The idol was originally pieced together from fragments the way you might rebuild a dropped jigsaw puzzle while still missing some key bits. Early reconstructions showed it as a tall plank with a humanoid head and a long body covered in carvings. Later studies revealed it was even taller than initially thought, meaning prehistoric carpenters were clearly not afraid of thinking big. The carvings covering the Shigir Idol are the most intriguing part. They're not random scratches from someone bored on a lunch break. These are deliberate, repeated patterns, herringbone lines, zigzags, crosshatches, and mysterious face-like shapes scattered across the length of the wood. What do they mean? The theories range from plausible to "this person has been watching too many documentaries at 2 a.m. Some archaeologists believe the markings represent a form of proto-writing, a way to record myths, laws, or even a creation story before alphabets were a thing. Others think they might be a spiritual map, a guide for navigating the physical and spirit worlds. A more skeptical camp suggests they were purely decorative, but this feels like underestimating the ancient artist. After all, you don't spend weeks chiseling patterns into a giant log for the same reason someone doodles in a notebook. One of the idol's stranger features is its head, or rather heads. The top has a clear face with eyes, a nose, and a straight mouth, but further down the body are more faces carved into different sections. Some researchers interpret this as representing multiple spirits or deities stacked vertically, each ruling over a different realm, heaven at the top, earth in the middle, and the underworld at the bottom. Others think it might depict ancestors or shamans, a sort of prehistoric family portrait, except everyone looks a bit stern and two-dimensional. Since we have no handy instruction manual, the idol's function is pure speculation. It could have been a sacred object used in rituals, a territorial marker, or even a prehistoric warning sign. The Mesolithic equivalent of trespassers will be prosecuted. The religious theory is popular because the geometric carvings could symbolize moral codes, myths, or cultural taboos passed down through generations. There's also the storytelling angle. Imagine a shaman standing before the idol, tracing the carvings while narrating the tribe's history to an audience seated around a fire. Without written language, these carvings could have served as prompts, a visual aid to ensure the story stayed consistent over centuries. Basically, it could be the world's earliest PowerPoint presentation, but with much better craftsmanship. Radiocarbon dating has placed the idol's creation around 9500 BCE, right at the end of the last ice age. This was a time when humans were transitioning from nomadic hunting and gathering to more settled ways of life. The size and complexity of the idol suggest it was made by a community with enough resources to spare someone for full-time art duty, a luxury in a world where most people were still worrying about getting eaten by bears. Its survival is a miracle of nature. Peat bogs are anaerobic environments, meaning no oxygen, which slows the decomposition of organic materials like wood. Without that bog, the Shigir Idol would have disappeared long before modern archaeologists could gasp over it in conference rooms. And then there's the joke that refuses to die, that the Shigir Idol is essentially the prehistoric IKEA manual, beautifully crafted but utterly impossible to interpret without the original context. No one knows which way it was originally meant to face, whether it stood upright, leaned, or was suspended. Maybe it came with other parts now lost, like a set of ritual tools or wooden figures. The lack of definitive answers is exactly why it continues to fascinate researchers and draw wild, sometimes wacky theories. Today, the Shigir Idol lives in a climate-controlled glass case in the Sverdlovsk Regional Museum. Visitors can stare at it in awe, much as people likely did 11,500 years ago. Though now the awe is tinged with a healthy dose of frustration. We can admire its craftsmanship, speculate about its meaning, and compare it to everything from cosmic maps to divine family trees. But the truth is, we'll probably never know, and maybe that's okay. After all, some mysteries lose their magic once solved. The Shigir Idol might just be one of those rare artifacts that keeps its secrets forever, reminding us that human creativity and our ability to confuse future generations is as old as humanity itself. Because whether it's a sacred relic, a cosmic map, or the Mesolithic equivalent of assembling a bookshelf without the screws, one thing's certain: this ancient wooden giant still knows how to keep us guessing. 40,000 years ago, long before the invention of Spotify, Bluetooth speakers, or even the humble kazoo, humans were already finding ways to fill the silence with music. Archaeologists have unearthed delicate flutes carved from bird bones and even chunks of mammoth ivory, the oldest known musical instruments in human history. These Ice Age jams weren't exactly top 40 hits, but they might have been the background soundtrack to some of humanity's earliest parties, ceremonies, and strange social rituals. Picture it: A group of hunter-gatherers gathered around a fire after a long day of chasing mammoths, when one guy inevitably reaches into his pouch and says, "Hey, want to hear something I've been working on?" And suddenly, you're stuck listening to the prehistoric version of a jam session. The discovery of these ancient instruments is mind-blowing for a couple of reasons. First, bone and ivory aren't exactly the most forgiving materials to work with. Carving a hollow tube with perfectly placed finger holes without shattering it requires patience, skill, and an eye for detail. This wasn't someone absent-mindedly whittling while waiting for dinner. This was craftsmanship. The flutes found in sites like Hohle Falls and Geisenklosterli caves in modern-day Germany show a surprising level of sophistication, with evenly spaced holes that could produce a range of notes, and unlike a basic whistle, which just makes noise. These instruments were designed to make music, actual melodies that could be repeated, remembered, and passed down. But here's the mystery. Why bother? Life in the Ice Age was already a full-time job. Food wasn't sitting in a fridge waiting for you. It was running around outside wearing fur. Shelter wasn't a warm apartment. It was whatever you could build out of animal hides before the weather turned nasty. Yet, somehow, people made time to make music. One theory is that music was a form of social glue. It brought groups together, helped build cooperation, and maybe even eased tensions. Imagine two rival hunting groups meeting at a shared water source. Instead of immediately trying to spear each other, someone plays a tune and suddenly there's dancing instead of bloodshed. It's not impossible. Another possibility is that these flutes had a ritual or spiritual purpose. Music has always had a knack for tapping into human emotions, and in a world full of dangers from saber-toothed cats to unexpected ice storms, anything that could connect you to the supernatural or bring good luck was worth trying. Perhaps certain melodies were believed to summon animals, appease spirits, or honor ancestors. Archaeologists have suggested that bone flutes could have been part of ceremonies in caves, where the acoustics amplified the sound into something almost otherworldly. And if you've ever been inside a cave, you know how eerie that echo can be. It's easy to imagine people believing the music was speaking to them from another realm. Of course, not all music needs to have a deep meaning. Humans also make music simply because it's fun. After a long day of survival, playing a flute by the fire could have been a form of entertainment, a way to lighten the mood. You don't need a Netflix subscription when you have a rhythm and a crowd that's happy to clap along. And let's be honest, some prehistoric musician probably did use it to impress potential romantic partners. The phrase serenade might not have existed yet, but the tactic is as old as time. The truly fascinating part is the skill it must have taken to learn these instruments. We often think of Ice Age humans as endlessly busy hunting and gathering, but someone had the time to practice until they could make something pleasant rather than painful to listen to. That means they had both the leisure and the motivation, a hint that Ice Age life might have had more moments of joy than we usually give it credit for, and perhaps even more intriguing. It suggests that music didn't just happen once. This was a tradition passed on from one person to another, evolving across generations. Then there's the material choice. Using bird bones wasn't just convenient, their hollow structure made them perfect for sound production. Mammoth ivory, on the other hand, was much harder to work with. To make a flute from ivory, Ice Age craftspeople had to split the tusk lengthwise, hollow it out, and reattach the halves seamlessly. That's not something you just try on a whim. That's a committed project, the kind of thing you'd only do if music mattered enough to risk ruining a valuable resource. Which means music wasn't just a side hobby, it was something worth investing serious effort into. It's tempting to think of these flutes as quaint relics, but they're really the earliest evidence of something deeply human, the need to create, to share, and to connect. Whether the music was for worship, for wooing, or just for the joy of making noise, it shows that even in the harshest environments, people found ways to express themselves. And that's probably the most enduring legacy of all. 40,000 years later, we're still gathering with friends, still making music, still listening to that one guy who insists on bringing his guitar or bone flute to the party. If you ever stumble across a mysterious, perfectly spherical stone in the Scottish countryside, Congratulations, you may have just found one of the most baffling archaeological artifacts in the world. These Neolithic stone spheres, typically about the size of a tennis ball but considerably heavier, have been turning up for over 2 centuries, and they continue to confuse experts, dating back around 5,000 years. They are finely carved, symmetrical, and sometimes decorated with intricate geometric patterns. The sheer craftsmanship suggests they weren't just casually made. Somebody, somewhere, decided these little orbs were worth the trouble of perfecting, and the trouble was substantial. Shaping granite or sandstone by hand without modern tools isn't a weekend project. It's the kind of task that makes you either very patient, very dedicated, or very obsessed with impressing your neighbours. Over 400 of these spheres have been found, mostly in Aberdeenshire, but also scattered across other parts of Scotland and even beyond. They vary in design. Some are smooth, others are covered in raised knobs, and a few have highly elaborate patterns that would have taken hours if not days of concentrated effort. Their uniform size is also puzzling. Was there some Neolithic standardization committee that approved the official stone ball dimensions? Did people travel miles to swap them, compare them, or even compete with them? The mystery deepens when you realize they weren't found in large piles like tools or pottery, but often in isolated contexts, sometimes in graves, sometimes in pits, and occasionally just out in the open, as if someone set one down 5,000 years ago and forgot about it. Theories about their purpose range from the plausible to the delightfully bizarre. One school of thought says they were weapons either handheld for bashing enemies or mounted on sticks as mace heads. It's a good theory until you consider that many of them are too delicate, their intricate carvings likely to be damaged if swung in anger. Another theory proposes they were weights for some kind of primitive measuring system, but the problem is they're not all the same weight. If you tried using them in a trade system, you'd quickly have angry customers yelling, "Hey, this ball weighs less than my goat." Some scholars suggest they had ceremonial or symbolic roles, perhaps status objects, that showed off the owner's skill or wealth. Imagine showing up to a Neolithic gathering, casually rolling one of these highly polished spheres in your hand while others looked on enviously. You'd be the prehistoric equivalent of a guy with the latest iPhone. And then there's the more whimsical theory, that they were the world's first stress balls or fidget toys. Sure, maybe that sounds ridiculous, but picture a Neolithic farmer coming home after a hard day of hauling stones for a monument nobody will finish in his lifetime. He sits by the fire, picks up his perfectly round stone and rolls it in his hands. The day's worries melt away. It's a strangely comforting image, and possibly not far from the truth. The fact that some are so perfectly balanced and symmetrical hints they could have been designed to be held and handled, not thrown or struck. The craftsmanship alone raises intriguing questions about the social structure of Neolithic Scotland. If someone could spend days shaping and carving a stone ball, it implies they had the time and resources to do so, which means the community valued this kind of work. Perhaps there were specialist artisans, whose reputations were tied to their ability to make the most flawless sphere. Were they paid in food, jewelry, or did they do it purely for the honor of being known as the stone ball master of their tribe? It's also possible these spheres had symbolic meanings tied to beliefs we can no longer reconstruct. The repeated use of geometric patterns, from spirals to intersecting lines, is a visual language now lost to us. Some designs resemble motifs found on standing stones and passage tombs, suggesting a shared cultural or religious code. The placement of the stone balls is equally telling. Finding them in graves suggests they might have been personal possessions meant to accompany the dead into whatever came next. In other cases, they appear in ceremonial contexts, perhaps used in rituals we can only guess at. Were they rolled along the ground in processions, passed from hand to hand in solemn gatherings? Or maybe they were simply displayed, their perfection catching the firelight and impressing everyone present. Their geographic distribution also adds a layer of mystery. Why so many in Aberdeenshire? Was this the heartland of stone ball culture? And if so, why did the trend not catch on in the same way elsewhere? Perhaps this was a regional fashion that never went global, a bit like bell-bottom trousers, but for the Neolithic. And yet, The few examples found outside Scotland hint at long-distance exchange networks, where these objects could have been traded or gifted. Imagine the surprise of someone in Ireland unwrapping a carefully packed stone sphere from Scotland, equal parts beautiful, impressive, and utterly useless in daily life. The fact that we can't definitively say what they were for is part of their enduring charm. Archaeologists have spent decades debating, measuring, and photographing them, and every time a new one is unearthed, the conversation starts again. They're a reminder that for all our technology and data, some aspects of human history remain stubbornly, deliciously opaque. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the people who made them would find our endless guessing hilarious, like someone in the year 7000 trying to work out the deep spiritual meaning of a bowling ball. If nothing else, the Scottish stone balls prove that even 5,000 years ago, humans liked to make beautiful, mysterious objects that served no obvious practical purpose. Whether they were weapons, symbols, toys, or just the result of one man's lifelong hobby, they're a testament to the fact that not all human creativity has to be useful. Sometimes, it's enough just to hold something perfect in your hand and feel a connection to the person who shaped it thousands of years before. When we picture prehistoric cave art, we usually think of galloping bison, majestic deer, and maybe a woolly mammoth or two, basically the Ice Age's greatest hits album. But tucked away in certain caves around the world, archaeologists have stumbled upon something far stranger: patterns, shapes, and symbols that don't fit the "let's paint what we hunt" narrative. Instead of glorious wildlife portraits, these walls are covered with zigzags, spirals, grids, dots, and eerie hand stencils that look like ghostly signatures. And these oddities raise a tantalizing question: what on earth were our Ice Age ancestors trying to say? These unconventional markings pop up from Argentina to Australia, from French caves like El Castillo to the rugged rock shelters of Indonesia. Some are more than 40,000 years old, older in fact, than many of the most famous animal depictions. It's as if early humans first grabbed their natural pigments, took one look at a cave wall and said, "You know what, I'm going abstract." For archaeologists, this is both thrilling and maddening. Unlike hunting scenes, which at least give you a clue, they were after reindeer that week, abstract art is wide open to interpretation. One of the most famous examples is the so-called dot and ladder panel in Spain's La Pasiega cave. At first glance, it looks like a primitive sketch of a pound sign, or maybe a hashtag, but it predates Twitter by about 64,000 years, which means the artists were definitely not subtweeting the Neanderthals next door. Some researchers think these symbols could be a form of proto-writing, a structured visual language used long before alphabets were invented. Others see them as maps, spiritual diagrams, or mnemonic devices for oral storytelling. And then there are the hand stencils. These appear across continents, from Sulawesi in Indonesia to Patagonia in South America. The method was simple but striking. Place your hand on the rock and blow pigment over it, leaving a negative silhouette. The result is haunting, like a personal "I was here" left to echo through millennia. Some of these stencils include missing fingers or oddly shaped digits, sparking debates about whether they're signs of ritual injury, frostbite, or just a creative way to freak out future archaeologists. Of course, not all explanations are solemn. Some anthropologists have entertained the idea that these markings might be the prehistoric equivalent of doodling, a pastime for long winter nights when hunting was impossible and everyone was stuck in the cave waiting for the Ice Age to chill out. Imagine a teenager 35,000 years ago leaning against the wall, carving repetitive zigzags because they were bored, and unknowingly creating a mystery that would stump experts for centuries. Then there's the shamanic theory. Some believe these strange markings represent visions seen during trance states, possibly induced by ritual dance, chanting, or mind-altering plants. In this view, the dots and spirals are not random. They're depictions of the inner mind's swirling landscapes, rendered in ochre and charcoal for all to see. This theory gets extra points for explaining why some patterns like meanders and grids appear repeatedly across distant cultures that never had contact with one another. The challenge, however, is proving any of this. Archaeologists can date the pigments, study the placement, and compare motifs across regions, but they can't exactly interview the artists. For every neat theory, there's an equally plausible counter-theory. Are those spirals maps of water sources? Calendars tracking lunar cycles? Or are they just the result of someone figuring out that drawing circles was satisfying? The lack of clear answers is part of the allure. These non-representational cave artworks force us to think of early humans not just as survival-driven hunters, but as imaginative, symbolic thinkers. They were capable of making art that didn't need to serve an immediate practical purpose. Art for the sake of expression, communication, or even beauty. It's a reminder that creativity is one of our oldest instincts, right up there with finding food and avoiding saber-toothed cats. And yes, maybe some of this was Ice Age graffiti. Archaeologists are cautious about using that term. But it's hard to resist the image of some ancient prankster sneaking into a sacred cave, scratching a cryptic symbol onto the wall, and smirking at the idea that nobody would ever figure out what it meant. Congratulations, nameless Paleolithic mischief maker, you've succeeded beyond your wildest dreams. In the end, these rule-breaking cave paintings are like messages from another planet. They speak in a visual code we haven't cracked, hinting at a worldview that is both familiar and alien. They show us that 40,000 years ago, humans were already experimenting with abstraction, symbolism, and perhaps even the earliest forms of writing. Whether they were spiritual diagrams, cryptic records, or Ice Age idol doodles, they're proof that the urge to make our mark on the world literally is as old as humanity itself. And who knows, maybe in another 40,000 years, someone will find our own walls covered in emojis, hashtags, and spray-painted signatures, and they'll wonder if it was all deeply meaningful, or just us tagging the modern equivalent of a subway wall. Picture this. You're an archaeologist brushing away layers of dirt, and suddenly you uncover a perfectly crafted stone axe head the size of your thumbnail. No, you haven't been shrunk down Honey, I Shrunk the Kids style. You've just stumbled into the curious world of ancient miniature tools. These tiny objects, found in sites spanning from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age and beyond, have baffled experts for decades. They're incredibly well made, often using the same techniques and materials as their full-size counterparts. Yet they're too small to chop wood, cut meat, or pound grain. Which raises the question, who or what were they made for? The detail on these objects is no joke. Many are crafted with such precision that you'd think the artisan was expecting to be judged by a panel of microscopic critics. We're talking flaked stone blades barely an inch long with perfectly sharpened edges, tiny bronze chisels with real grooves for grip, and even miniature grinding stones that could fit in the palm of your hand, assuming your palm belongs to a squirrel. These weren't rough practice attempts by novice toolmakers. They were made by skilled hands who clearly knew the craft inside out. That alone rules out the beginner blacksmith theory. No one starts learning violin by building a Stradivarius for ants. One of the most popular theories is that these were children's toys. Archaeological digs in places like Scandinavia, Japan, and North America have unearthed little tool sets alongside remains of small clay figurines and toy boats. The thinking goes that kids, just like today, might have enjoyed imitating adults at work. After all, nothing says prehistoric fun like pretending to flay a mammoth with a blade barely large enough to slice a grape. But there's a problem. Many of these tools are so fragile or sharp that handing them to a child would have been like giving a toddler a scalpel. Either ancient parents were far more trusting than modern ones, or the toy theory isn't the whole story. That brings us to ritual use. In many ancient cultures, miniatures held symbolic meaning. They could serve as offerings to deities, a way of presenting the spirit of an object without needing to sacrifice the full-sized, valuable version. For example, in some Bronze Age graves, tiny weapons were placed alongside the dead, possibly to equip them in the afterlife without wasting a perfectly good battle axe. Think of it like burying someone with a model car instead of the actual convertible. Sentimental, symbolic, and far easier to carry. There's also the possibility of these being status objects. In societies where craftsmanship was a respected skill, creating something perfect on a minuscule scale might have been the ultimate flex. You could imagine a master toolmaker proudly handing over a miniature spearhead to show, yes, I can make a flawless weapon and I can make it small enough to fit in your nostril. In this reading, the tools weren't meant to be used but to be admired, like ancient artisan business cards, except infinitely cooler. Some archaeologists have proposed the training theory that these miniatures were practice pieces for apprentices, but again, the level of detail makes this suspect. When students practice, they make mistakes, and these tiny tools rarely show the telltale flaws of a learner's hand. If they were training projects, the bar for acceptable in ancient workshops must have been impossibly high, the prehistoric equivalent of a piano teacher expecting Mozart on day one. Then there's the downright strange possibility. These tools were made for mythical or supernatural beings. Folklore from multiple cultures includes stories of little people, wee folk, or spirits who live alongside humans. Some traditions even describe offering tiny objects to these beings as a gesture of respect or appeasement. In this light, miniature sickles and knives might not have been for human hands at all, but for whatever lived in the unseen world. Whether that's charming or unsettling depends entirely on how much you like the idea of invisible neighbors with their own toolkits. Of course, there's always the chance that some were just art for art's sake. Humans have been making impractical but beautiful things for as long as we've had opposable thumbs. Maybe someone in 3000 BCE simply looked at a regular-sized hammer and thought, cute, but what if it could fit in my pocket? The urge to miniaturize is timeless. Just ask the creators of dollhouses, scale models, and the modern fascination with tiny cooking videos on the internet. Apparently, we've always found joy in making the small look spectacular. The funny part is that despite centuries of speculation, no one theory fits all finds. Some miniature tools were found in children's burial sites, others in temples, and still others in scattered domestic trash heaps. It's entirely possible that different communities used them for entirely different reasons, from toys to talismans to prestige items. The only thing archaeologists can agree on is that the craftsmanship is impressive enough to demand respect. In the end, the mystery of ancient miniature tools might remain unsolved, and maybe that's part of their charm. They're like little whispers from the past, hinting at stories we'll never fully hear. Were they playthings, prayers, or proof of skill? We may never know. But one thing's for sure, somewhere in history, someone put an incredible amount of time into making the world's most committed mouse toolkit. And honestly, that's a legacy worth admiring. When you think of calendars, you probably picture neat little squares on a fridge magnet, or maybe a digital one that's constantly yelling at you about overdue tasks. You probably don't think of a lump of mammoth bone covered in scratches or a windswept Scottish field with some suspiciously arranged pits. But tens of thousands of years before humans were inventing desk planners or counting down to the weekend, Stone Age people were apparently scheduling things. Yes, long before we imagined ancient humans as sophisticated enough to mark birthdays, they were carving time into the landscape itself. One of the most mind-bending examples comes from Scotland's Warren Field site, dating back to around 8000 BC. Archaeologists discovered a set of 12 shallow pits arranged in a semicircle. On the surface, it might look like the remains of a really uninspired stone circle, or perhaps the world's least impressive amphitheater. But the alignment suggests something far more advanced. It may have been used to track the lunar months. Think about that. We're talking Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who didn't yet have metal tools, keeping a schedule for the moon. Apparently, even back then, you had to know when the next full moon party was. But the moon wasn't the only thing worth tracking. Across Europe and Africa, archaeologists have found animal bones like the famous Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, dated to about 20,000 years ago, covered with carved notches. These weren't random doodles by bored prehistoric teenagers. Many scholars believe they represent tally marks for days or lunar phases. In other words, someone in the late Stone Age looked up at the night sky, saw the moon waxing and waning, and thought, I should keep a spreadsheet. And while we can't be 100% certain about their exact purpose, the precision is hard to ignore. The Ishango bone, for example, has 3 distinct columns of notches. some grouped in patterns that match lunar cycles almost perfectly. To put that in perspective, at a time when human survival depended on finding food, avoiding predators, and not freezing to death, someone still had the mental bandwidth to think, yes, but what day is it really? Why does this matter? Because it suggests a level of abstract thinking that historians used to assume came much later. Calendars require more than just observational skill. They demand pattern recognition, record keeping, and the ability to project into the future. You have to notice that every 29 or so days, the moon repeats itself, and then you have to decide it's worth recording that pattern for practical use. This is basically the first step towards history itself, taking note of when things happen so they can happen again. It also implies that time wasn't just an abstract concept, it was a resource. Knowing when certain seasons began could mean the difference between arriving at a hunting ground at the right moment or showing up to find all the mammoths gone and only the smell of their droppings left. It was a survival tool disguised as a celestial diary, and here's the kicker. These early calendars predate agriculture in many regions. We tend to associate timekeeping with farming, sowing, and harvesting crops on schedule. But these artifacts suggest that hunter-gatherers were already counting days and planning ahead before they were planting seeds. Which means, at least in some parts of the world, timekeeping didn't grow out of agriculture. Agriculture might have grown out of timekeeping. That's a plot twist for the ages. Now, of course, not everyone agrees with the calendar interpretation. Some scholars suggest that notched bones could have been counting something entirely different. Perhaps tallies of kills, recorded debts. Yes, even hunter-gatherers probably owed each other favors, or simply aesthetic decoration. But when the spacing between marks consistently matches lunar cycles, it's hard not to see a connection. It's also worth imagining the human experience behind these objects. Somewhere thousands of years ago there was a person possibly wrapped in furs, sitting by a fire, carefully carving marks into bone or wood, watching the sky night after night. They probably didn't call it a month or think in terms of dates, but they were engaged in the same kind of thinking that keeps your phone's calendar app running today. The continuity is almost unsettling. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize it too much. It's entirely possible some of these so-called calendars were the work of one individual who just really liked carving things. In other words, this could be humanity's first astronomer or its first obsessive hobbyist. But either way, the precision suggests intention, not accident, and that's what makes it so fascinating, the idea that tens of millennia ago, people weren't just reacting to nature, they were anticipating it. They were developing a mental map of time, something so fundamental to us today that we barely notice it, but which would have been revolutionary in a world where the future was as uncertain as the next hunt. The humor writes itself, because nothing says I understand the moon, like stabbing 29 holes into a mammoth bone and then carrying it around as if to say, I have receipts, whether it was for tracking food sources, coordinating communal events, or simply making sure they didn't miss the cosmic equivalent of a Netflix release date. These early calendars prove that even in the Stone Age, humans couldn't resist organizing their lives around the heavens. If anything, it makes our modern obsession with calendars and planners look like an echo of something far older, proof that we've been trying to master time for a very, very long while, and time, as always, has been laughing at us. If there's one thing history has taught us, it's that humans have been making strange, baffling what-were-they-thinking objects for as long as they've had opposable thumbs, from carved mammoth tusks that look like they belong in a modern art museum, to stone tools so tiny they might as well be mouse cutlery. The archaeological record is littered with creations that raise more questions than they answer. And the best part? That's exactly what makes them so fascinating. We tend to imagine early humans as purely practical stone scrapers for hunting, fires for warmth, shelters for survival. And sure, that was part of the job description if you wanted to keep breathing past the age of 25. But the sheer variety of non-essential artifacts tells another story. Our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were thinking, they were experimenting, innovating, and sometimes, yes, creating things that don't make any obvious sense to us now. Take the mystery objects scattered across archaeological sites, figurines with exaggerated features, decorated tools, ceremonial masks, and intricate carvings. Each one is a frozen whisper from a world we can't fully understand. Maybe that clay animal wasn't a toy but a spirit charm. Maybe that decorated spear wasn't meant to be used at all but was a status symbol, like the prehistoric equivalent of a sports car. Or maybe it was just something a particularly artsy Stone Age teenager made to pass the time while avoiding mammoth hunting duty. This is where archaeology becomes part science, part detective work, and part exercise in humility. We can test the carbon dating, study wear patterns, compare artifacts across continents, and still be left scratching our heads. That's because objects don't come with instruction manuals, and the people who made them aren't around to explain. Sometimes the truth is simply gone, lost to time like a badly labeled box in history's attic. And you know what? That's not a flaw, that's the fun. If every artifact came with a neat little tag reading, made in 9000 BC, used for lunar festival rituals, please return after use, archaeology would be tidy and boring. The thrill comes from piecing together fragments of evidence, knowing full well the final picture might never be complete. A carved stone may have had 3 different meanings over 3 different generations. A painted cave wall might have been sacred to one group and graffiti to the next. The uncertainty forces us to imagine, to put ourselves in the place of people separated from us by thousands of years, but linked by the same spark of creativity. And that's the deeper truth behind all these mysteries. They're proof of continuity. We like to think the ancient past was entirely alien to us. But the more you look, the more you see the same patterns. People made art. People invented games. People had rituals, inside jokes and hobbies that probably baffled their neighbors just as much as they baffle us. If you think TikTok trends are strange, imagine stumbling across a 12,000-year-old engraved reindeer bone and trying to work out why. Of course, the fact that some mysteries may never be solved doesn't mean archaeologists are giving up. On the contrary, every unanswered question is an open invitation. The more enigmatic the object, the more researchers swarm around it, devising new theories, running new tests, and occasionally getting into heated arguments at academic conferences. There's nothing quite like watching 2 experts passionately debate whether a tiny flint knife was a child's toy or a ceremonial offering to the moon. The rest of us get to enjoy the speculation. Was that polished stone orb in Scotland a weapon, a symbol of unity, or a particularly disappointing paperweight? Did the elaborate carvings on that bone tell a myth, record a calendar, or serve as the world's most impractical to-do list? The not knowing keeps us engaged, and the possible answers are often more entertaining than the real ones might be. Because here's the thing, mystery ages well. The longer a question stays unanswered, the more room it leaves for wonder. Every time we think we've got it all figured out, the archaeological record throws us another curveball, a site that's older than expected, a tool made from an impossible material, an artifact buried in a place it shouldn't be. Each one is a reminder that history is not a static timeline but a living puzzle, with missing pieces and edges that don't quite match. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. If we had perfect knowledge of the past, we might stop looking. But because we don't, we keep digging, keep imagining, and keep finding pieces that make the puzzle bigger, stranger, and more beautiful. In the end, the Stone Age wasn't just about survival. It was about curiosity, experimentation, and making things that future humans would spend centuries overthinking. Which means, in a strange way, they were exactly like us. We make memes, they made mammoth bone carvings. We hoard quirky souvenirs, they buried polished stones for reasons we'll never quite grasp. And while the tools and technology have changed, the impulse behind them hasn't. The moral? If you stumble across a mysterious object in your own life, whether it's a gadget in a kitchen drawer or an artifact in a field, don't be too quick to dismiss it. Someone, somewhere, put time and effort into making it, even if the meaning is lost to you. That sense of wonder you feel when you turn it over in your hands, that's the same spark that connects you to the people of the distant past. The truth is, mystery is half the fun, and the other half, knowing that, thousands of years from now, some future archaeologist might be scratching their head over your possessions, wondering what on earth you were thinking when you bought them. If history were a dinner party, Nellie Bly would be the guest who shows up early, refuses to sit down, and somehow rearranges all the chairs before dessert. Born Elizabeth Jane Cochrane on May 5, 1864, in the small town of Cochrane's Mills, Pennsylvania, a place named after her family, she arrived in the world already carrying a legacy. Her father, Michael Cochrane, was a respected judge and mill owner, which meant the family lived comfortably. That comfort didn't last. When Nellie was just 6, her father died without leaving a will. This wasn't just sad. In 19th century America, it was financially catastrophic. Property and money didn't automatically go to widows and children, so her family's middle-class stability collapsed faster than a poorly built hayloft. Elizabeth, or Pink as her family called her, yes, like the color, and yes, it was adorable, went from a life of piano lessons and nice dresses to something much grimmer, her mother taking in boarders to make ends meet. Nellie got a taste early on of how quickly fortunes could turn, and it left her with a lifelong refusal to accept no as a final answer. She attended boarding school for a while, but couldn't afford to finish. For many women of her time, that would have been the end of the story. Marry young, stay home, and raise children. But Nellie was not many women. She was more like several women compressed into one, with extra energy to spare. She tried her hand at teaching, but it wasn't a calling so much as a temporary parking spot in life's journey. Then came the spark that lit her journalism career, a newspaper column. In January 1885, Elizabeth read an opinion piece in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled "What Girls Are Good For." Spoiler, the answer was not much. The anonymous author argued that women belonged in the home, not the workplace, and certainly not in anything requiring intelligence or ambition. Most readers might have sighed, grumbled, and turned the page. Elizabeth, however, sharpened her metaphorical sword. She wrote a fiery rebuttal under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl, defending women's right to education and independence. It was passionate, articulate, and in newspaper terms, absolute gold. The Dispatch editor, George Madden, was impressed enough to print her letter and invite her to the office. And here's where we can pause for a moment of visualization. A young woman in her early 20s, in an era where most reporters were cigar-chomping men, walking into a newsroom full of ink stains, noisy typewriters, and skeptical stares. She didn't flinch. Madden offered her a trial piece, and when she delivered, he offered her a job. Now, about that pen name, Elizabeth Jane Cochrane might have been respectable, but newspapers in the 19th century loved a catchy byline. Madden borrowed Nellie Bly from a popular Stephen Foster song, probably without realizing he'd just named one of history's most famous journalists. From the start, Bly's reporting wasn't about society gossip or garden parties, the usual women's pages fare. She dove straight into investigative journalism before the term was even trendy. She wrote about working women, factory conditions, and the lives of the poor, with the kind of empathy and stubbornness that made employers nervous. Her articles weren't polite observations from a distance. They were sharp, immersive, and sometimes a little too honest for comfort. When factory owners complained about her exposés, the Dispatch reassigned her to safer topics like fashion and flower shows. That was like asking a racehorse to pull a pumpkin cart. She lasted about as long as you'd expect before packing her bags and heading for New York City in 1887. With no job, little money, and an iron will. For 6 months she knocked on newsroom doors and got rejections that probably sounded polite but really meant, "Women can't do this." Finally, she walked into the offices of the New York World, owned by the legendary Joseph Pulitzer. She pitched something outrageous. She would go undercover at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island to expose its conditions. This was not your standard day-in-the-life story, this was method journalism. She checked herself in, stayed for 10 days, and documented horrifying abuse and neglect. The resulting series, 10 Days in a Madhouse, made her a household name and helped reform the asylum system. She'd proven herself fearless, resourceful and ready for assignments no one else wanted. And that's Nellie Bly in a nutshell. A woman who didn't politely climb the career ladder, but rather sprinted up it, banged on the editor's office door and said, "Hi, I work here now." She wasn't just reporting the news, she was redefining what it meant to be a journalist, and she was doing it in an era when most women were still being told to stay in their sphere. Nellie's sphere? The entire globe. And soon enough she was going to prove it. In the late 19th century, the New York World was the kind of newspaper that loved spectacle, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, yes, the guy your high school journalism teacher kept talking about. It thrived on stunts, scandals and stories that made readers spit out their morning coffee. But even Pulitzer's newsroom had its limits, and in 1888, Nellie Bly ran straight into one of them. It started with a book, Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, published in 1872, had been a runaway hit. Readers adored the tale of Phileas Fogg, the unflappable Englishman who bets his friends he can circumnavigate the globe in, you guessed it, 80 days. The novel was fast-paced, exotic, and in the case of certain plot points, wildly unrealistic, which was part of the charm. But in the 1880s, global travel was no longer purely the stuff of fiction. The age of steamships and railways had shrunk the planet, and wealthy travelers were beginning to test the limits of how quickly it could be crossed. Nellie Bly read Verne's novel and didn't just enjoy it, she saw an opportunity. Why not try it for real? But instead of being a gentleman with a valet and endless funds, it would be her, a single woman, traveling alone, racing against the clock. The concept was as much about proving a point as it was about adventure. In an era when the popular belief was that women couldn't travel without chaperones, trunks full of dresses, and a small mountain of hat boxes, Nellie's plan was basically to dropkick that stereotype overboard. So she marched into the newsroom and pitched the idea, send her around the world solo, and let her try to beat Phileas Fogg's fictional record. She was confident, she was persuasive, she probably expected a yes, when do you leave? What she got instead was a mix of laughter, skepticism, and the editorial equivalent of patting her on the head. A woman, one editor scoffed, alone, impossible, you'd need a man to protect you. Others warned about the dangers, foreign languages, unpredictable timetables, seasickness, the ever-present risk of getting stranded in a place where the local cuisine might be, shall we say, unfamiliar. And then there was the logistical argument. Women supposedly couldn't pack light. You'd need at least a dozen trunks, someone said. The delay at customs alone would ruin the schedule. Nellie's response could have been framed and hung in a museum of sass. Very well, she said. Send a man. He will need to carry so many trunks, so many things, that it will take him longer. If you send me, I will take one small bag, and I will go. That one small bag wasn't just bravado, it was strategy. She planned to travel with a single handheld gripsack, think early carry-on bag, about the size of what most modern travelers use to hold their chargers and snacks. Into it, she would pack only the essentials, one extra dress, a lightweight coat, a few pairs of undergarments, toiletries, and some writing materials. No evening gowns, no hats for every occasion, no just-in-case shoes. If an item wasn't absolutely necessary, it wasn't coming. As far as Nellie was concerned, this wasn't a pleasure cruise, it was a race. Her packing plan was so radical for the time that it almost became part of the pitch itself. It wasn't just about showing that she could travel fast, it was about demonstrating that women could be practical, efficient, and self-reliant. That single gripsack would become one of the most famous pieces of luggage in history, proof that you don't need half a wardrobe to circle the globe. Even with her confidence, the editorial team still hesitated. The idea was bold, yes, but bold ideas were expensive and risky. What if she missed a connection? What if political trouble erupted somewhere along her route? What if she, heaven forbid, didn't make it back at all? Newspapers were in the business of selling headlines, but preferably ones that didn't involve losing star reporters in foreign ports. It took months of persuasion, persistence, and perhaps the realization that if they didn't do it, another paper would. for the world to finally say yes. But when they did, they didn't just agree to the trip, they made it into a full-blown publicity stunt. Her departure would be announced in advance, her progress would be tracked in print, and readers could follow her journey like a serialized novel unfolding in real time. Nellie was ready. She had no interest in traveling with an escort, not even another reporter. She argued that being alone would make her faster, more flexible, and less of a target for suspicion. This wasn't a sightseeing tour, it was a race against both the clock and the cultural expectations of the day. And here's where her humor and grit shone through. She famously remarked that if she could carry her own bag, she could carry her own safety. The luggage she settled on was so small that, as she later joked, it could almost fit under her arm. Smaller than some people's lunch bags, yet somehow containing everything she needed for a 70-plus day sprint across the globe. By the time her editors gave the final green light, Nellie wasn't just planning a trip. She was preparing to make history. The stakes were high. If she succeeded, she would prove that women could be just as adventurous, resourceful, and determined as any man, and she'd do it while shaving days off a famous fictional record. If she failed, she'd have to live with knowing the editor's condescending "I told you so" would echo through the newsroom forever. She didn't intend to fail. On the morning of November 14, 1889, the pier in Hoboken, New Jersey was a flurry of steam, gulls, and the kind of chatter that only happens when someone is about to do something people think is impossible. Nellie Bly, wrapped in a simple checkered coat and carrying her famously tiny gripsack, boarded the Augusta Victoria, a German steamship bound for Europe. The clock had started ticking. Every puff of steam from the ship's funnels was a reminder that she had precisely 72 days to make it back, though of course she didn't yet know the exact number. She only knew she was racing against 80, and she intended to beat it. The Augusta Victoria was considered a fine vessel for its time, but in 1889, fine didn't mean luxurious in the modern sense. Cabins were snug. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and salt water, and the crossing would be dictated by the moods of the North Atlantic in late autumn, which ranged from slightly choppy to, "Are we sure this ship isn't about to capsize?" Nellie wasn't prone to seasickness, but she wasn't immune to the tedium of being surrounded by water for days on end. She quickly learned the rhythms of life at sea. Meals served with military punctuality, promenades on deck when the weather allowed, and evenings filled with conversation, reading, or the Victorian equivalent of networking. Passengers eyed her curiously. A lone woman traveling without a chaperone was already unusual, but one who openly admitted she was attempting to race around the world. That was borderline unbelievable. She answered questions politely, but she kept her eyes on the prize, the English Channel. Every hour gained on this leg could make or break her schedule later. The North Atlantic, ever theatrical, decided to give her a proper send-off by throwing in heavy swells and gusting winds. The Augusta Victoria pitched and rolled, sending half the passengers into their cabins clutching at their stomachs. Nellie, unshaken, took to pacing the deck in her sturdy boots, her face set in that determined "I have places to be" expression that would soon become her trademark. This wasn't a leisurely crossing, this was her first test against time. When the ship finally approached Southampton, England, Nellie knew she couldn't linger. Every port was a potential trap of delays, customs checks, missed connections, over-enthusiastic reporters. She moved with brisk efficiency, clearing the port and making her way toward London, where she'd transfer to the next leg of her journey. But before she plunged deeper into Europe, there was a detour she couldn't resist. A short trip to Amiens, France, to meet the man whose fictional race had set hers in motion, Jules Verne. It was the kind of meeting that could have been the climax of a novel. The young, ambitious journalist visiting the literary titan in his own home. Verne, now in his 60s, lived in a stately house that looked as though it had been plucked straight from one of his novels. When Nellie arrived, she found him polite, gracious, and perhaps inevitably skeptical. He'd read about her journey and found it intriguing, but he didn't believe she could beat 80 days. Travel schedules were unpredictable, he explained, and delays inevitable. Steamships could be slowed by weather, rail lines could be disrupted, and the coordination required to move seamlessly from one mode of transport to another was formidable. Nellie listened respectfully, but one can imagine the slight twitch of a smile at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't there to debate probability. She was there to prove possibility. The visit was cordial, and Vern even wished her luck, though his tone may have carried the faint suggestion of, "You're going to need it." The detour to Amiens was brief. Nellie knew that while a conversation with Jules Verne was a delightful feather in her travel cap, time was not her friend. She boarded her next train with the same calm focus she'd had when stepping onto the Augusta Victoria. This wasn't a sightseeing trip. Every connection was a calculated move in a larger game. Her crossing of the English Channel, another potential bottleneck, was blessedly smooth. In November, the channel could be treacherous, but she managed the transit without delay, moving swiftly from boat to train as though she were simply changing buses in her hometown. By the time she reached continental Europe, she was already in travel mode, a mental state known only to those who have learned to live out of a single bag while racing a clock. She didn't linger over meals, she didn't browse markets, and she certainly didn't wander off the main routes. Every minute mattered. Looking back, this first leg of her journey might seem like the easy part. But for Nellie, it was the crucial proof of concept. If she could leave on time, hit her first major milestone without incident, and keep ahead of her timetable, she'd build the momentum she needed for the harder legs to come. Any stumble here could snowball into disaster later, so when she finally boarded the train that would carry her deeper into Europe, she was in the best possible position, ahead of schedule, unshaken by the Atlantic, and armed with the blessing, however doubtful, of the man whose fictional race she was already in the process of beating. Imagine meeting the author who inspired your grand adventure and having him say, essentially, "Nice idea, but probably not going to happen." For most people, that might be deflating. For Nellie Bly, it was fuel. The world was waiting, and she was already on her way. The trouble with traveling in 1889 was that no matter how glamorous the idea sounded on paper, the reality usually involved a great deal of staring at the same wall for days, eating questionable meals, and praying the boat didn't decide to test your swimming skills in the middle of the night. For Nellie Bly, the next stage of her record-breaking journey meant weaving together an ambitious sequence of European trains and steamships, each one with its own schedule, quirks, and likelihood of causing seasickness. After parting ways with Jules Verne in France, armed with his good-natured but not entirely confidence-inspiring skepticism, Nellie made her way to the train platforms, determined to waste no time. Every minute mattered. Missing a connection could derail her entire 72-day plan. Victorian trains were fast by the standards of the era, but speed was relative. They could carry you across a country in a few hours, yes, but they could also stop unexpectedly for an hour so that the engineer could chat with the station master about goats. From Paris, Nellie journeyed south toward the Italian coast, heading for the port city of Brindisi. The European rail network was impressive for the time, but still a puzzle of interconnected national lines, each with its own timetable and ticketing system. There was no such thing as a Eurail pass or an app to check schedules. If you wanted to know when the next train departed, you asked someone and hoped they were both honest and sober. Nellie, however, had an advantage. She had traveled through Europe before during her reporting days and wasn't intimidated by a few language barriers or the occasional suspiciously staring customs official. By the time she reached Brindisi, she had barely stopped moving long enough to eat a proper meal. The port itself was bustling, a tangle of sailors, porters, and merchants yelling over one another in a dozen different languages. The smell of coal smoke from steamships mixed with the scent of salt water, and less romantically, fish that had been left out in the sun just a bit too long. Nellie boarded her next vessel, a steamship bound for Port Said, and the entrance to one of the most ambitious engineering marvels of the 19th century, the Suez Canal. If you've ever traveled through a canal at the leisurely pace of a steamship, you'll understand the paradox Nellie experienced. She was still technically moving, but it felt like standing still for hours at a time. The Suez Canal was both a shortcut and a scenic trap. flat desert landscapes stretching endlessly on either side, dotted occasionally with camels and small clusters of buildings. The heat could be oppressive, the air dry and sharp, and the pace, well, let's just say you could measure it in polite strolls per hour. Once through the canal, the ship turned toward the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Next stop, the island of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. But that meant days of ocean travel, days of fighting the twin enemies of boredom and seasickness. Life on board a Victorian steamship was an odd mix of too much time to think and too little to do. There were meals, of course, and walks along the deck. The ship's officers might strike up a conversation, and fellow passengers sometimes gathered in the lounge for reading or card games. But there were no films, no podcasts, and certainly no Wi-Fi. Entertainment consisted of whatever you brought with you and the occasional dramatic moment when the ship's bell rang to announce land on the horizon. And then there was the food. Steamship cuisine in the late 19th century had two goals: fill passengers up and keep them alive until the next port. Whether it succeeded depended heavily on your stomach. The British-style menus leaned heavily on stews, salted meats, bread, and always tea. Endless tea. The logic was simple. Hot water boiled into tea was safer to drink than plain water, and it kept passengers in a state of mild caffeine fortitude against the monotony. But after your seventh cup in a single day, the charm wore off. Seasickness was an ever-present risk. Steamships of the era were powerful but far from stable in rough waters, and Nellie's route meant braving stretches of ocean known for their unpredictable swells. Even veteran travelers could find themselves clutching the nearest railing with a grim look of resignation. If the motion didn't get you, the food might. A universal truth of long-distance travel that transcends centuries. Through it all, Nellie maintained her focus on the clock. Every harbour arrival, every customs inspection, every small delay was another potential threat to her goal. But she also had moments of quiet observation, watching fishing boats bob near the coasts, seeing the changing styles of dress and architecture as she moved farther from Europe, and realizing that the world, though vast, was suddenly shrinking under her feet and the ship's paddle wheels. By the time she approached the shores of Ceylon, Nellie had experienced the full rhythm of this part of the journey. The frantic rush to catch a train, the slow grind of the canal, the restless monotony of the open sea. Her record attempt was still on track, but she had already learned a valuable lesson. Speed wasn't just about moving quickly, it was about mastering the art of endurance in the spaces between the action, and she was going to need that skill for the thousands of miles still ahead. If Nellie Bly's trip had been a polite afternoon stroll around the block, this would have been the part where someone shouted, "Race you to the end," except instead of a sidewalk, she was halfway around the planet, and instead of a friend, it was the Cosmopolitan magazine throwing down the gauntlet. By December 1889, Bly's steamship had threaded its way through the Indian Ocean and dropped anchor in Singapore, a British colonial jewel buzzing with trade, tropical humidity, and an odd mix of Victorian manners and street market chaos. Here, Nellie had two jobs: soak in just enough local culture to make her newspaper dispatch sparkle, and avoid being so distracted by the sights that she missed her next connection. Singapore's port was a swirl of languages, sarongs and spices. Bullock carts lumbered past opium dens. Shopkeepers hawked everything from ivory carvings to tins of British biscuits that had likely travelled farther than she had. She wrote about these places with a knack for capturing atmosphere in just a few lines, the kind that made readers feel they could almost smell the cinnamon in the air, and maybe the less pleasant whiff of the nearby fish market. From Singapore, she boarded another steamship bound for Hong Kong. This leg of the journey was a test of endurance more than excitement. The weather swung between relentless sun and sudden tropical squalls, the kind that drenched everything in sight before vanishing in minutes. On deck, passengers made small talk, compared travel stories, and in Nellie's case, tried to figure out whether the tea was keeping her alive or making her seasickness worse. Below deck, the cramped cabins were hot and close, the air thick with coal dust and salt. This was travel in the 19th century, romantic in books, but in reality a blend of awe-inspiring views and a desperate wish for fresh laundry. Hong Kong in the late 1800s was a port city with a split personality, part British colonial outpost, part bustling Chinese metropolis. Bligh had barely a day to take in the terraced streets, ornate temples, and the endless parade of dockside traders. She dashed off quick interviews with locals and foreigners alike, weaving their voices into her dispatches. If anyone wondered why she wasn't staying longer, the answer was simple: the clock was ticking. Unbeknownst to her until mid-journey, it wasn't just her editors counting the days. The Cosmopolitan had decided to send another reporter, Elizabeth Bisland, to race her around the world, but in the opposite direction. The news came in the sort of casually devastating way that only Victorian journalism could manage. Someone simply mentioned, mid-conversation, "Oh, by the way, another lady's doing the trip too." Nellie's response was, reportedly, a mix of surprise and a touch of competitive fire. Bisland, unlike Bislan, hadn't planned this trip for months. She'd been pulled away from her breakfast table and packed onto a train within hours. But the Cosmopolitan was hoping the novelty of two women racing each other would sell more papers, and they weren't wrong. Suddenly, Bligh wasn't just travelling for a deadline, she was defending her title in a contest she hadn't even agreed to enter. From Hong Kong, the next big jump was Japan, and Bligh was pleasantly surprised at how quickly she arrived in Yokohama. This was where the faster-than-expected part of her journey came into play. Steamships, by their very nature, were unreliable in schedule, prone to weather delays, mechanical failures, or the occasional bureaucratic slowdown at customs. But her crossings in this stretch had been almost unnervingly smooth. She began to wonder if she might beat her own ambitious timetable. Yokohama was unlike any other stop so far. Neat streets lined with wooden houses, bustling tea shops, and rickshaws darting like dragonflies. She marveled at the politeness of the locals and the efficiency of the port, a stark contrast to the chaos of some earlier stops. She bought souvenirs, small enough to fit in her single bag of course, sampled local food, and took mental notes for her readers back home who might never see Japan in their lifetimes. In her dispatches, she avoided the condescending tone some Western travelers used, instead focusing on the charm and individuality of the people she met. As her ship prepared to depart Japan for the Trans-Pacific crossing, Bligh took stock of her progress. She was far ahead of schedule, possibly weeks ahead, but she also knew that ocean crossings could erase that advantage in a heartbeat. Bisland was still somewhere on the opposite side of the globe, but steamships didn't care about rivalries, only about weather, tides, and coal supplies. Still, the sense of competition added an undeniable thrill to the trip. Every departure felt like the crack of a starting pistol, every arrival a tiny victory. And if the Victorian press wanted to turn her carefully planned journey into an international spectacle, she wasn't about to shy away. After all, nothing spices up travel quite like finding out you've been entered into an unplanned race. By the time the Yokohama harbour faded into the mist, Nellie Bligh was more than just a traveller with a deadline. She was the frontrunner in the world's first truly global publicity stunt, and she was determined to win, seasickness and all. If the first half of Nellie Bligh's journey had been a blur of timetables, whistle stops and frantic dashes for departing trains, the second half now slowed to the pace of a weary tortoise with a limp. The Pacific Ocean, in all its endless blue indifference, stretched between Yokohama and San Francisco like a smug, watery obstacle, daring her to try and be on time. She boarded the steamship Oceanic in Yokohama with a sense of urgency bordering on desperation. Every hour counted now. She had just learned that the Cosmopolitan's Elizabeth Bisland, her accidental rival, was already tearing across Europe in the opposite direction. This wasn't just a record attempt anymore. It was an unplanned transcontinental race between two women whose paths would never cross, but whose names were now linked in newspaper headlines. The Pacific, however, did not care for headlines. From the moment Oceanic left port, Nellie realized that the fastest way across the ocean was still far too slow for her tastes. She paced the deck daily, her boots clapping against the planks with all the impatience of someone mentally willing the waves to push them faster. Other passengers strolled for leisure, She strode like the ship's progress depended on her steps. The sailors began giving her the kind of cautious, amused glances usually reserved for people who mutter at clouds. There was, of course, the weather. December in the Pacific could be moody, clear skies one day, then rolling grey swells the next. Nellie learned the humbling truth of steamship travel. You could have all the coal in the world, but if the wind and waves decided you'd had enough speed for one day, that was it. Storm systems in mid-ocean were like invisible toll booths. You'd pay with hours, sometimes days, and get nothing in return but queasy stomachs and waterlogged optimism. The seasickness wasn't hers, but she wasn't spared the misery of being surrounded by it. Shipboard life during bad weather had a way of turning even the most elegant travelers into pale, blanket-wrapped ghosts haunting the saloon. Meals became quieter affairs, punctuated by the occasional dash for fresh air, not for the view, but for survival. Still, there were attempts at distraction. The ship's officers organized games and lectures. Cards were dealt, and the sound of shuffling mingled with the hum of the engines. Tea flowed like a lifeline, though Nellie quickly learned that the definition of tea varied wildly at sea, ranging from bracingly hot and comforting to, is this just boiled seawater with aspirations? But she drank it anyway, partly for warmth, partly because there was little else to do. In quieter moments, Nellie retreated to her cabin to write her dispatches. The world's readers were following her trip like a serialized adventure novel, and she knew the value of keeping them hooked. She described the voyage with her trademark wit, noting the strange camaraderie that formed on a ship where everyone was both confined and adrift. Friendships bloomed quickly, partly because there was no escape from each other. But always, in the back of her mind, the clock ticked. She calculated distances obsessively. How many knots per hour? How many hours lost to storms? How much coal was left in the bunkers? The Oceanic might as well have been a floating stopwatch. The captain, amused by her urgency, reassured her that they were making good time. She smiled politely but knew that good time was relative, and her definition didn't match his. There was also the maddening reality of ports. In a journey dictated by speed, stops could be as exasperating as delays. Coaling stations were the worst. They were essential. Without coal, a steamship was just an expensive raft, but they were also slow, messy, and unavoidable. Nellie stood at the rail in Hong Kong and Yokohama, watching black lumps vanish into the ship's belly, feeling every shovelful as another tick off her personal timer. The ocean itself offered moments of reluctant beauty. There were days when the water lay flat and glassy, the horizon a perfect unbroken circle. Sunsets blazed across the sky in oranges and purples so intense they looked painted on. Dolphins sometimes appeared alongside the ship, keeping pace with effortless grace, a reminder that nature had its own speed records, and humans weren't in the running. But as they neared the American coast, anxiety returned in full force. Delays had cost her dearly. She thought of Elizabeth Bisland, who by now might be somewhere on a train, hurtling toward New York from the west. Nellie had no way of knowing the exact standings of their race, but uncertainty was a motivator more potent than coal. When at last the faint outline of the California coast appeared on the horizon, Nellie felt the familiar thrill of forward motion. Real, measurable progress after weeks of water. San Francisco was within reach, and from there the continent awaited. She could practically hear the train whistles in her head, a promise that land travel at least would feel fast again. She stepped ashore with the energy of someone who'd been storing up motion for days. There were interviews, photographs, and congratulations from curious locals who'd followed her story in the papers. But Nellie barely lingered. The race wasn't over. The Pacific had been conquered, slowly, stubbornly, and with more tea than she'd ever imagined drinking in a lifetime. But now came the final dash across America. Her lesson from the crossing: you can outpace people, trains, and even deadlines, but you'll never outrun the ocean's schedule. And as she put it later, it's hard to feel like a record breaker when your greatest enemy is a horizon that never seems to get any closer. Nellie Bly's first steps onto American soil in San Francisco were met with a welcome that would have made royalty blush. After weeks of dodging monsoons, swapping ships, and outrunning her own jet lag, though no one called it that yet, she found herself at the center of a national media storm. Reporters jostled for position, photographers hoisted their ungainly cameras, and curious citizens crowded the docks to catch a glimpse of the young woman who was making headlines around the globe. She had left New York as a determined journalist with a suitcase and a plan. She returned to the United States as something entirely new, an American folk hero in the making. Every handshake, every flash of her smile was a reminder that this was more than just a personal challenge. Now this was a race the entire country was following, a contest in which every hour counted. And the New York World, her employer, wasn't about to let her lose. New York World executives had been busy while Nellie was still somewhere between Yokohama and California. They arranged for a series of special trains to whisk her across the continent in record time. This was not your average ticket on the Union Pacific. This was a carefully choreographed logistical ballet. Telegraph operators sent ahead her arrival times, ensuring locomotives were fueled, engineers were ready, and tracks were cleared of any slower-moving traffic. The moment she stepped off the ship, she was hustled toward her carriage. The train was decorated with banners reading, "Welcome Nellie Bly," and "Around the World in 75 Days." The question mark was less about doubt and more about daring fate to keep up. Inside, she found her seat reserved, her route mapped, and her name on every passenger's lips. She might have been in a hurry, but the trip wasn't exactly lonely. Crowds gathered at every whistle-stop town, standing in snowdrifts and waving newspapers to prove they were keeping up with her progress. In some places, bands turned out to play patriotic tunes. In others, school children were let out of class to watch her train go by. At each stop where she could spare a moment, she stepped down to shake hands and answer a few shouted questions. Though she refused to linger, the view from her train window was a blur of winter landscapes, pine-covered mountains heavy with snow, endless plains glazed with ice, and small towns huddled against the cold. Telegraph poles flickered past like the tick marks of a giant stopwatch. Somewhere along the way she realized she was no longer just traveling, she was performing a public drama. Newspapers published daily updates on her whereabouts. The Chicago Tribune ran maps charting her progress. Children in Ohio mailed her letters of encouragement. Shopkeepers in Kansas put up signs reading, "Good luck, Nellie." Strangers who had never met her spoke of our Nellie as though she were a family member racing home. And hovering in the background was the question everyone wanted answered. Could she beat Elizabeth Bisland? The Cosmopolitan's competitor had taken the opposite route, west to east, and was herself barreling toward New York. It was as if America had been split into two cheering sections, each rooting for their chosen heroine. Travel in the 1890s was no small feat, even with special treatment. The railways were fast for their day, but weather remained a merciless equalizer. Heavy snow in the Rockies slowed her train to a crawl. Crews shoveled furiously to keep the tracks clear, and in some places the train's cowcatcher acted more like a snowplow. Ply paced the narrow aisle of her carriage like a caged tiger, her watch in her hand as though she could will the minutes to pass faster. At one stop in Nebraska, a telegraph message arrived from the New York World, urging her to keep pressing forward. Bisland is making good time. Whether or not the message was entirely accurate didn't matter. It was exactly the sort of competitive spark that kept her from relaxing. The trip wasn't without moments of levity. Somewhere in Iowa, a group of pranksters unfurled a banner reading, "Miss Bisland was here first." Bly laughed it off but was quick to remind reporters that she was not in the least worried, just impatient. By the time her train rolled into Chicago, the race had reached fever pitch. Reporters boarded mid-route to conduct interviews and file dispatches via telegraph at the next stop. Newspapers began printing speculative headlines like "Bly or Bisland, who will triumph?" Some went so far as to print mock victory editions in advance, ready to swap out the winning name at the last possible second. Even the engineers seemed to catch the spirit of competition. One driver, known for his reckless but skilled speed runs, reportedly vowed to make up an hour by the time they reached the next division point. Through it all, Bliddy kept her composure. though she admitted privately to friends that the final stretch felt like racing the shadow of my own deadline. Every tick of the train's brass clock seemed louder than the engine itself. As she crossed into the final leg toward New York, the enormity of her journey began to sink in. She had faced typhoons, logistical chaos, endless customs inspections, and now the most American obstacle of all, the last mad dash over a snowbound continent. But here she was, hours from the finish, with the weight of public expectation riding on her shoulders like extra luggage. In a matter of days, she had transformed from a lone traveler, quietly boarding a steamer in Japan, to a national celebrity with an unofficial train entourage, her name shouted from platforms and printed in headlines coast to coast. The funny thing? Just 2 months earlier, she'd been packing her single small bag, wondering if anyone beyond her editors would even care. Now entire towns were holding their breath as she raced by in a blur of steam and snow. Because in America, nothing spices up a trip quite like turning it into a race, especially one the whole country can watch in real time. January 25, 1890, started like any other winter morning in New Jersey, except for the fact that the state was about to host one of the biggest welcome home events in recent memory. The cold air bit at the cheeks of onlookers, but the crowd didn't care. They were bundled up in layers, waving flags and craning their necks toward the train tracks. Somewhere down the line, a special locomotive was thundering toward them. On board sat Nellie Bly, and she wasn't just returning from a trip. She was returning as a legend. The numbers were staggering for the time. 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes to circle the globe. Jules Verne's fictional Phileas Fogg had done it in 80 days on paper. Bly had just done it in reality, and still had time left over to pick up a souvenir or two. The New York World, her newspaper employer, had hyped her journey every step of the way, printing daily updates like cliffhanger serials. The moment the train came into view, the station erupted, hats flew into the air, bands struck up triumphant marches, kids perched on their parents' shoulders to get a glimpse of the woman who had just made the rest of the world seem smaller. Nellie stepped down from the train to a roar that probably could have been heard all the way back in Yokohama. She was bundled against the winter chill, but her smile radiated warmth, a mix of exhaustion, pride, and maybe a little disbelief that she'd actually pulled it off. But there was no time to linger. Crowds surged forward, eager to touch her hand, shake it, or at least say they'd been in her presence. Police and railway staff formed a protective corridor as she was escorted toward the waiting carriage. A lesser person might have wilted under the chaos. Nellie thrived in it. She knew the importance of this moment, not just for her career, but for every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't fit for bold, dangerous, or ambitious pursuits. Her arrival wasn't the end of the journey. It was the opening act of the victory lap. The world had organized a massive welcome home celebration in New York City, complete with brass bands, banners, and speeches. As the carriage rattled through the streets, shopkeepers leaned out their doors waving. Factory workers took breaks to cheer. Someone even released a flurry of confetti, the paper bits catching in her hair like celebratory snow. When she finally stood before the crowd to speak, she didn't give a grand oration. That wasn't her style. Nellie had built her career on action, not flowery speeches. She thanked her supporters, praised the efficiency of her travel arrangements, with a pointed nod to the trains that hadn't been late, and admitted that yes, she was looking forward to a good night's sleep in her own bed. Her voice carried the same self-assured tone that had convinced her editors to fund the trip in the first place. Breaking the 80-day record was more than just a personal triumph. It was a public demonstration that women could be fast, fearless, and resourceful without needing male chaperones. In the late 19th century, that was practically revolutionary. Most newspapers of the era still treated female journalists as curiosities, fit for women's interest pages or society columns. Bly had just blown past those limits at 40 miles per hour, riding the rails to a new definition of what was possible. In the days that followed, she gave interviews, posed for photographs, and signed autographs. Children sent her letters, admirers sent flowers, opportunistic businesses tried to cash in. selling Nellie Bly board games and souvenirs. One company even made a Nellie Bly-themed card game, turning her race against time into a family parlor activity. Though the rules of the game didn't include seasickness or negotiating with train conductors for priority passage. And of course, the world basked in the reflected glory. Sales spiked. Competitors groaned at having missed the story of the year. Readers who had been following her dispatches from far-off lands now devoured her post-trip accounts, eager for behind-the-scenes details. Nellie, being Nellie, didn't shy away from sharing the uncomfortable parts, the rough seas, the travel delays, the maddening waits for connections. It made the victory all the sweeter, proving that the journey hadn't been a straight, easy sprint, but a constant test of wit and endurance. There was one final flourish that cemented her place in history, her official time, printed in bold headlines across America. 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes. The precision mattered. It was an achievement that couldn't be hand-waved as about 2.5 months. It was exact, irrefutable, and impossible for even the most skeptical to ignore. And the funny part, she'd done it all without the conveniences we take for granted today. No GPS telling her the fastest route, no Wi-Fi for instant updates, no airline peanuts to complain about while crossing the Pacific, just ships that relied on the whims of the weather, trains that occasionally played chicken with the timetable, and her own relentless determination. Even with those limitations, she had not only beaten the fictional record, she had smashed it by more than a week. When the celebrations finally quieted, Nellie returned to her life as a journalist. But the world had changed. She was no longer just reporting on history, she had made it. And in doing so, she'd sent a message across continents and oceans. If a woman wanted to race the clock, she didn't need permission, only a ticket and the nerve to use it. Or, as one observer put it at the time, she went around the world in less than 80 days, and around the doubts of the world in even less time. Let's travel back to a time before the sewing machine, a time when every single stitch in your clothing was made by hand, one tiny jab at a time, with the speed and efficiency of a tortoise on a coffee break. If you think waiting a week for an online order to arrive is unbearable, imagine waiting 6 months for your pants only to discover they don't fit. Welcome to the world before the needle went turbo. For thousands of years, making clothes meant one thing. You sat down with a needle, thread and fabric, and you sewed, and you sewed, and then just for variety you sewed some more. There was no magical pedal to push, no whirring machine to take over. It was all muscle power, eyeball coordination, and eventually a hand cramp that could rival a blacksmith's. Sewing wasn't just slow, it was back-breaking slow. For a simple shirt you might spend 10 to 14 hours hunched over, piecing together panels with careful little stitches, hoping your thread didn't knot itself into a miniature Gordian disaster. Pants? Expect a week. A fancy dress with lace and pleats? Block off the next 3 months of your life? And the toll it took on your body, strained eyes from staring at thread so thin it could hide in a hairbrush, sore fingers with more needle pricks than fingerprints, a permanent hunch from bending over fabric for hours. Some tailors joked they could identify their co-workers by their silhouettes alone. Everyone looked like they'd been quietly turning into question marks. Before sewing machines, there were really only 3 ways to get clothes. Make them yourself, hire a tailor or seamstress, inherit someone else's clothes and pray they fit. For working-class families, most sewing was done at home. Mothers, grandmothers and older sisters often spent the evenings mending socks, patching shirts, or making new garments from old ones. Recycling wasn't a trend, it was survival. A coat that no longer fit your eldest child would be picked apart, recut, and stitched into a jacket for the younger one, sometimes several times over. By the time it reached the youngest, it looked less like a coat and more like a patchwork quilt with sleeves. Tailors and seamstresses, meanwhile, were the skilled professionals of the clothing world. They worked for wealthier clients or made custom garments for special occasions. If you had money, you could stroll into a tailor's shop and be measured for a suit. Then you waited, and waited, and waited some more. Tailors had no magic tricks to speed things up. Even with an assistant, The process took weeks or months, and if you dared complain about the delay, the tailor might remind you that Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was your waistcoat. The idea of fast fashion didn't exist. If someone told you in the 1700s that your shirt would be ready by next week, you'd probably check to make sure you weren't dreaming. Most wardrobes were tiny by modern standards because clothing was expensive in both time and money. The average person might own 2 or 3 complete outfits, one for work, one for Sunday best, and maybe a third for special occasions like weddings or funerals, often the same suit for both. The wealthy, of course, had more variety, but even they had to plan ahead. Want a new ball gown for the winter season? Better commission it in spring and hope you don't change your mind about the color halfway through. Once the fabric was cut, there was no going back. The slow pace of clothing production meant fashion trends moved at a glacial crawl. By the time you finished making a dress in the latest style, that style had probably been latest for 2 years already. But since everyone else was also behind, nobody noticed. In fact, the slowness of sewing may have actually kept people more stylish. Trends lasted longer simply because they took forever to spread. Every home had a sewing kit, often kept in a decorative box or basket. Inside, needles, spools of thread, fabric scraps, and maybe a thimble or two. These weren't optional. They were survival tools. If your clothes tore, you couldn't just run to a store and replace them. You mended them immediately. Letting a hole grow unchecked meant you'd soon be walking around with half a shirt and an embarrassing draft. Some families even had a designated sewing day, where everyone sat together in the evening and worked on repairs. It was a social occasion, in the same way that peeling potatoes for 3 hours can be social. If you were unlucky, you might spend half a year working on a garment only to realize you'd miscalculated the size. At that point, you either unpicked every stitch, another month of work, or convinced yourself that oversized was the new fashion. The same went for mistakes. One wrong snip of the scissors, and your perfectly planned coat was now a slightly awkward vest. Many tailors had a saying, "Measure twice, cut once, cry forever." In short, before sewing machines, clothing was a commitment. Every outfit was the result of hours, sometimes months of careful labor. Clothes weren't just things you wore, they were investments, statements, and for the people making them, a constant test of patience and eyesight. The world didn't know it yet, but a mechanical revolution was coming, one that would turn sewing from a marathon into a sprint, and fashion from a slow shuffle into a dizzying race. If the 18th century had a motto for invention, it might have been, "What if we strap gears to it and see what happens?" This was the era when ambitious tinkerers tried to mechanize everything: looms, pumps, clocks, even things that didn't really need mechanizing, like egg beaters. So naturally, someone eventually thought, hey, what if we could make sewing faster than one slow, miserable human at a time? And thus began the first awkward, hesitant steps toward the sewing machine. Unfortunately, those first steps looked a lot like tripping over your own shoelaces. In 1755, a German-born inventor named Charles Frederick Wiesenthal filed a patent in England for something billed as a mechanical device for sewing. It was essentially a needle with a point at both ends and an eye in the middle, designed to be used in a machine. To modernize, it wasn't really a machine at all, more like a fancy stick with aspirations. It's not entirely clear if Wiesenthal ever built a working prototype, and if he did, there's no surviving evidence that it actually sewed anything other than maybe his own expectations shut. But the idea was there. Sewing didn't have to be a purely human-powered task. It could, in theory, be outsourced to gears, cams, and moving parts. A terrifying thought for anyone who had just spent a week hemming one skirt. Fast forward to 1790, and we meet Thomas Saint, a London cabinet maker who decided that sewing could use a bit of the old industrial magic. Saint filed a patent for what is widely recognized as the first full-blown sewing machine design, at least on paper. Saint's contraption was a beast. Built for working with leather and canvas, it featured an awl that punched holes in the material, followed by a needle that passed through those holes to make a stitch. It was hand-cranked and made from heavy metal parts, the kind of thing that would look just as at home in a blacksmith shop as a tailor's. The twist? For over 100 years, no one was quite sure if Saint actually built the thing. In fact, it wasn't until 1874 that sewing machine historian William Newton Wilson found Saint's patent, reconstructed the design, and discovered it worked, kind of. The machine stitched, but it also skipped stitches, chewed fabric, and generally behaved like it was in a bad mood. So if you've ever cursed at a sewing machine because it jammed your thread, congratulations, you've shared an experience with Thomas Saint. Part of the problem was that inventors of the 18th century had limited materials and manufacturing precision to work with. Machining small, consistent parts was still tricky and expensive, and sewing requires a lot of precision. If the needle was even slightly misaligned, the stitch wouldn't form. If the tension was off, the thread would snap. And unlike weaving, which could be mechanized using big, obvious, repetitive motions, sewing is a delicate ballet between needle, thread, and fabric. Early inventors were basically trying to teach a clockwork gorilla to do embroidery. The results were, predictably, mixed. Even if one of these early machines had worked perfectly, there's a good chance the public would have still hated it. People in the late 18th century were suspicious of gadgets, especially ones with pointy bits moving at unnatural speeds. Sewing was considered a safe domestic task, until you added a whirring arm and a sharp needle moving up and down faster than your eyes could track. To make matters worse, these early designs looked terrifying. Imagine a hulking metal frame, clanking gears, and a big needle repeatedly stabbing the air like it was auditioning for a role in a slasher film. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd want in your parlor next to the tea set. One could easily imagine a house guest glancing at Thomas Saint's creation and whispering, Is that for sewing or for interrogating people? While Wiesenthal and Saint get the historical spotlight, there were likely dozens of lesser-known inventors making their own crude sewing contraptions in workshops across Europe. Unfortunately, many of their machines probably ended up as scrap metal victims of bad design, lack of funding, or the simple fact that nobody wanted them. And then there were the improvers, folks who took existing sewing methods and bolted on some levers or pulleys, claiming they had revolutionized the craft. These often worked no better than the originals, and sometimes worse, but that didn't stop enthusiastic inventors from showing them off at fairs and exhibitions. Imagine spending months building what you're sure is the future of clothing production, only to crank the handle and watch the needle jam halfway through the first seam. Now imagine you're demonstrating it to potential investors at that exact moment. The 18th century was full of such awkward silences. While none of these first machines became household items, they planted the seeds, or maybe threaded the needles, for the industrial sewing revolution to come. They proved it could be done, even if the early models were more mechanical curiosity than practical tool. And so the world kept on hand-stitching its shirts and trousers, while inventors quietly plotted in their workshops. The age of the hand-sewn garment wasn't over yet, but the first tiny wobbly steps toward its end had been taken. The world just didn't know yet that the next wave of sewing machine inventors would arrive with better materials, better engineering, and far less patience for slow stitching. The needle hadn't gone turbo yet, but it had started to twitch. By the mid-19th century, the dream of a fully functional sewing machine was dangling just out of reach, like an unhemmed trouser leg waiting for someone with the right needle. Into this scene stepped Elias Howe, a Massachusetts-born mechanic who, unlike his predecessors, actually seemed determined to make the thing work. Howe was not born into wealth or privilege. In fact, his early life was as patched together as the garments he grew up around. He had the hands-on skills of a tinkerer, the persistence of a mule, and as history would show, the stubbornness of a man who could spend years in a legal cage match without flinching. In 1846, Howe unveiled his sewing machine, a strange but elegant contraption that finally cracked a puzzle inventors had been fumbling with for decades. Its magic trick was the lock stitch, a clever mechanism that interlaced two threads so that the stitch wouldn't unravel even if you tugged at it like an impatient toddler. The needle was the real stroke of genius. Instead of being the same as a hand needle, Howe placed the eye at the pointy end, letting it pierce the fabric while carrying the thread straight through. The process, though mechanical, produced neat, durable stitches faster than any pair of human hands could manage. For the first time, people could imagine a future where clothing didn't have to be the result of endless hours of hand sewing in dim candlelight, and where a shirt didn't cost a week's wages. Of course, inventing a revolutionary machine and making money from it were two different things. Howe, convinced his design was a ticket to fortune, traveled to England to try his luck selling it overseas. Unfortunately, business negotiations did not go as planned. He sold the rights for a pittance, found himself struggling financially, and eventually returned to the United States, only to discover that while he'd been away, other inventors had not so subtly borrowed his ideas. One of these borrowers was Isaac Singer, a name that would soon become synonymous with sewing machines worldwide. Singer's design looked suspiciously familiar: the lock stitch, the eye-pointed needle, the general mechanics. The only major difference, Singer had slapped his own name on it and was marketing it with showmanship that would make a circus promoter blush. To Howe, this was nothing short of daylight robbery. Thus began one of the most notorious patent battles of the 19th century, a drama that played out in courts, newspapers, and factories. Howe, usually a quiet and methodical man, became a legal bulldog. He argued that his 1846 patent covered the key innovations every other successful machine was using, and therefore anyone selling them owed him royalties. His opponents countered with claims that they'd independently developed their machines, and that Howe's patent wasn't as broad as he claimed. The courtroom became a theatre, with arguments as sharp as tailors' shears and egos as inflated as a crinoline skirt. The public, meanwhile, watched the spectacle with fascination. Here was a machine that could change the clothing industry forever. If only the inventors could stop stabbing each other in the back long enough to put it into mass production. The legal wrangling dragged on for years, with Howe pouring time, money, and energy into defending his claim. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built the machine to save people countless hours of sewing, and now he was spending countless hours metaphorically sewing together legal documents. Eventually, Howe emerged victorious. The courts ruled that his patent did indeed cover the lock-stitch mechanism, and other manufacturers would have to pay him royalties for every machine sold that used it. The money began to flow in, transforming Howe from a struggling inventor to a wealthy man practically overnight. By the time his patent expired, he had amassed a fortune, and the sewing machine had secured its place as one of the most important inventions of the industrial age. But the fight had done more than just make Howe rich. It had set a precedent for patent law in America. It became a cautionary tale for inventors everywhere. No matter how brilliant your idea, there's always someone ready to copy it, sell it, and leave you holding the threadbare remains, unless you're ready to fight back. And so Elias Howe's legacy was cemented not just in steel and gears, but in ink and legal precedent. The sewing machine might have revolutionized fashion, but its path to success had been stitched together with courtroom arguments, stubborn persistence, and a few well-placed legal jabs. In the end, Howe had proved that innovation was only half the battle. The other half was making sure nobody stole your stitches. By the mid-19th century, the sewing machine was no longer a strange contraption that sat in the corner gathering dust while suspicious tailors muttered about it under their breath. Thanks to a few ingenious tweaks and one particularly flamboyant businessman, it was about to become the ultimate household appliance. That man was Isaac Merritt Singer, part inventor, part showman, and entirely unafraid to stitch his name into history. Singer didn't just want to sell a machine, he wanted to sell an idea that sewing could be fast, fun, and crucially, not something you had to take out a second mortgage to own all at once. Singer was not the first to create a functional sewing machine. Elias Howe and others had beaten him to that honor. But he had an uncanny ability to make a complicated mechanical device seem as approachable as a loaf of bread. His breakthrough was less about inventing from scratch, and more about improving on what was already there. He made his machine more durable, less prone to jamming, and importantly, easy for an ordinary person to learn. The hand crank became smoother, the frame sturdier, and the design more visually appealing. If Howe had been the mechanical genius, Singer was the marketing maestro. Where others saw a tangle of gears and needles, Singer saw the potential for spectacle. He traveled around the country staging public demonstrations of his machines, showing off how a shirt could be stitched together in a fraction of the time it would take by hand. He didn't do it in dusty workshops. Oh no, he did it in bustling department stores, theaters and fairgrounds, with a flair that made the sewing machine look like the 19th century equivalent of a magic trick. People didn't just watch, they gasped. Some even refused to believe it was real until they tried it themselves. Singer's true stroke of genius, however, was in figuring out how to get these machines into homes without scaring away buyers with the price tag. A sewing machine in the 1850s cost as much as several months' wages for the average worker, hardly the kind of money you kept lying around between the butter churn and the woodpile. Singer introduced something radical: installment payment plans. Instead of dropping the full sum at once, customers could make small monthly payments, taking their shiny new machine home immediately. It was the kind of idea that today fuels everything from cars to smartphones. But in the 1850s, it was downright revolutionary. Suddenly, households that would never have dreamed of owning such an expensive device found themselves threading needles on their very own Singer. It wasn't just about sewing faster, it was about pride. Owning a sewing machine became a status symbol, a sign you were moving up in the world. Housewives could now make more clothing in less time, families could save money by repairing garments rather than replacing them, and some even used their machines to take in sewing work for extra income. The ripple effects reached far beyond the parlor. Singer didn't limit himself to one market either. He went global. The company opened offices in Europe, Russia, and beyond, turning the sewing machine into an international sensation. In Russia, Singer machines became so widespread that the company was eventually producing millions of units there alone. In England, the machines were shipped by the crate load, often with a well-trained salesperson to show the new owners exactly how to use them. Singer's brand recognition became so strong that even decades later, Singer was used as a generic term for any sewing machine, much to the irritation of his competitors. It helped that Singer himself had a flair for the dramatic. He dressed well, traveled lavishly, and had a personal life filled with enough scandal to keep the gossip papers busy. Whether intentional or not, his reputation added to the intrigue of the brand. After all, who wouldn't want a machine endorsed by the most talked about man in the sewing world? He understood something crucial about marketing. People don't just buy products, they buy stories, status, and the feeling of being part of something bigger. Singer gave them all three, wrapped in polished cast iron and a mahogany cabinet. By the time Singer's approach had fully taken hold, the sewing machine was no longer a luxury for the elite. It was a must-have tool for the modern household. And it had gone from intimidating contraption to familiar friend. Every turn of the crank meant a little more time saved, a little more money in the pocket, and a little less hand-cramping misery. And all of it came down to one man's refusal to sell his product the boring way. Isaac Singer sewed up the market not by having the best machine in the world, but by convincing the world it couldn't live without his. When the sewing machine first hummed to life in factories, it didn't just speed up clothing production. It detonated a full-on industrial fashion revolution. Before this, making clothes was a labor-intensive process that involved an army of hand stitchers hunched over fabric for hours, days, or weeks. Now, one operator could do in an hour what a room full of skilled seamstresses could barely manage in a day. The factory floor went from a quiet room of needle and thread whispers to a roaring chorus of gears, belts, and the rhythmic clack-clack of metal teeth chewing through cloth. The transformation was instant and dramatic. In the mid-19th century, large textile mills in Britain, France, and the United States began adopting sewing machines on a massive scale. Clothing production jumped to a speed previously unimaginable. What once took 14 hours could now be done in under one. A shirt that might have cost a week's wages could now be sold for a fraction of the price, which meant the middle and working classes suddenly had wardrobes that weren't just Sunday best, but Monday through Saturday decent. Factories became high-pressure, high-output machines themselves. Workers, often women, were expected to keep pace with the machines. A skilled operator could guide a garment through the whirring needle with the precision of a concert pianist. The downside: a missed beat didn't just mean an off note. It could mean stitching your finger to the latest shipment of trousers. Safety guards were still decades away. The sewing machine didn't just change local economies, it rewrote the global playbook. Textile centers like Manchester and Lowell were no longer bound by the slow trickle of hand production. Bolts of cloth could be shipped, sewn and reshipped in an endless loop of global trade. Ships loaded with ready-made garments left industrial ports bound for markets in South America, Africa and Asia, bringing the latest Western fashions to places that had never before had such instant access. In return, these same ships brought back raw cotton, silk and wool to feed the ever-hungry machines, and the results were visible everywhere. Fashion trends no longer took years to cross oceans, they took months, sometimes weeks. A Parisian dress design spotted in a magazine could be copied, manufactured in New York and sold in Buenos Aires before the original even went out of style. The world went from slow fashion to, "Didn't you just buy that shirt yesterday?" in record time. Factories grew bigger and more specialized. One building might cut fabric, another sew, and a third handle the finishing touches, buttons, embroidery and pressing. Specialized sewing machine models emerged, each designed for a specific task: hemming, buttonholing, or even stitching elaborate patterns. Machines began to replace not just the speed of human hands, but their artistry. For some, this was a triumph of progress. For others, it was the death knell of handmade craftsmanship. The ripple effects extended into entirely different industries. Military uniforms could now be produced on a scale that matched the growing armies of the mid-19th century. Hospital linens, workwear, and even sails for ships were stitched by machine, making mass mobilization in both war and commerce faster and more efficient. In a way, the sewing machine became the unsung logistical hero of industrial expansion. Global trade itself shifted gears. The speed of production demanded faster shipping and more reliable supply chains. Steamships replaced sailboats, railways expanded to feed the export machine, and telegraphs kept manufacturers in touch with suppliers and buyers across continents. A fashion house in London could place an order for 10,000 blouses in the morning, and factories in Boston could start cutting fabric that same day. But this whirlwind progress had a darker underside. Sweatshops became a grim reality, with workers crammed into poorly ventilated rooms for long hours under the roar of machinery. The same sewing machine that gave rise to affordable clothing also gave rise to the exploitative labor practices that reformers would spend decades fighting against. In the US, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 would tragically underline how unsafe these workplaces could be. An ironic twist for a machine that was marketed as a tool of liberation and empowerment. By the end of the 19th century, the sewing machine had fully embedded itself into the DNA of the global economy. Fashion became not just a local statement but an international conversation, sometimes a very loud one, conducted in factories where shouting over the din of hundreds of machines was the only way to be heard. The legacy was clear. The sewing machine had not only stitched together garments but economies, trade routes, and entire cultures. And once the world had tasted the speed and efficiency of machine sewing, there was no going back. Handmade clothing would remain. But now, as a luxury, the slow-cooked meal in a world addicted to fast food. In short, the sewing machine turned clothing from a craft into an industry, and from an industry into a global force. It didn't just change what people wore, it changed how they thought about fashion, labor, and even time itself. The needle had moved, and the world would never again follow the same pattern. When the sewing machine first whirred its way into homes and factories, it wasn't just a piece of metal and moving parts. It was a social revolution with a bobbin. For women, it offered two contradictory gifts: the promise of economic independence and the curse of back-breaking, mind-numbing work. The sewing machine was both the ticket to earning one's own wages and the reason many women spent most of their waking hours hunched over a clattering needle, squinting in dim light, surrounded by the industrial symphony of snipping scissors, steam, and shouting supervisors. Before its invention, Sewing was entirely a handcraft, something women did at home for their own families, or if desperate for income, for a handful of wealthy clients. Work was slow and poorly paid, often done by candlelight, with hours slipping by unnoticed except for the cramp in one's hand. The sewing machine smashed through that old pace like a locomotive through a chicken coop. Suddenly, garments that took days could be finished in hours. That efficiency was a blessing for the owners of factories and dress shops. For the workers? Well, it meant quotas, endless quotas. In bustling garment districts from New York to Manchester, armies of women filled the sewing floors, turning raw cloth into trousers, shirts and dresses at speeds unimaginable to their grandmothers. They were machine operators, a term that made it sound like they were in control, though in reality, they were tightly managed cogs in a vast production line. The wages were low, the hours long, and breaks were rare enough that even the sewing machines might have liked one. These workplaces could be sweltering in summer, freezing in winter, and so loud that women had to shout just to be heard. Not that there was much time for chatting when a foreman was glaring over your shoulder. Yet the sewing machine was also a ladder, even if that ladder was missing a few rungs. For women who needed to support themselves, sewing skills could mean a steady, if exhausting, income. Some rose to positions of senior seamstresses or cutters, jobs that came with slightly better pay, and more importantly, a small measure of authority. Others became self-employed dressmakers, using a home machine to cater to private clients, which offered more freedom and fewer chances of losing fingers to industrial accidents. At home, the sewing machine had a different, quieter kind of power. Instead of endless hours bent over needle and thread, housewives could finish repairs and clothing production far more quickly, theoretically freeing time for rest. Of course, free time was a Victorian illusion. Every hour saved on sewing could simply be filled with other chores, but the machine allowed families to make clothes that looked sharper, lasted longer, and could even follow the latest fashions, as long as someone in the household had the skill to operate it. Manufacturers and advertisers understood the marketing potential of this new domestic magic. Early ads showed elegant women serenely operating gleaming sewing machines in well-lit parlors, as if sewing a gown were as relaxing as sipping tea. These campaigns carefully framed the sewing machine as a mark of modernity, refinement, and skilled womanhood. Owning one wasn't just practical, it was aspirational, a sign that a family was moving up in the world. The message was clear. The modern woman knew her way around the latest technology, as long as she was still making clothes for everyone else. Some advertisements went further, painting women as industrial professionals in miniature, operators in charge of their own little household factories. The language suggested empowerment, but the subtext was simple: more sewing, faster sewing, better sewing. It wasn't an escape from traditional expectations, just an upgrade in tools. The result? Women could make more garments in less time, meaning they could now produce for both their family and, if they were entrepreneurial, paying customers, all without leaving the house. This duality of liberation and confinement was perhaps the sewing machine's greatest contradiction. In factories, it brought women into the cash economy, giving them wages they could control, or at least partially control. Some husbands still had opinions about who held the purse strings. At home, it allowed women to create better clothing for their families and even to earn side income, which could make the difference between scraping by and saving for a rainy day. But it also cemented the idea that sewing, fast sewing, perfect sewing, constant sewing, was women's work, whether paid or unpaid. By the late 19th century, some women began to organize around these issues, demanding shorter hours, better pay, and safer working conditions. The sewing machine, for all its mechanical ingenuity, had become a symbol in these struggles, a reminder that progress without fairness often came with a high human cost. In labor halls and union meetings, women who once silently stitched now spoke out, their voices as sharp as their needles. The funny thing, in the hands of the right salesperson, the sewing machine was sold as pure glamour, sleek curves, polished surfaces, gold decals. It was the sports car of the parlor, minus the horsepower but with all the prestige. The only difference was that while a sports car might take you on a joyride, the sewing machine took you on a 12-hour shift, and no matter how you dressed it up, that was a ride you couldn't exactly park in the garage when you'd had enough, because in the end, the sewing machine was like the Victorian era's ultimate multi-tool for women, part ladder, part trap, part status symbol, part survival kit. It could lift you up or wear you down, often both in the same day, and if you were lucky you got to go home, turn off the machine and rest until tomorrow, when the bobbin called your name again. When the sewing machine barged into the world of fashion, it didn't just change how clothes were made, it ignited a full-blown identity crisis in couture. For centuries, high fashion had been defined by painstaking, hand-sewn craftsmanship. Every stitch was a whisper of status, every seam a sign that someone had labored over silk or velvet for weeks. But by the mid-19th century, here came this shiny contraption that could stitch faster than any human. And suddenly the fashion world had to decide, embrace the machine or clutch the embroidery hoop for dear life. Some designers were quick to adapt. Why spend weeks sewing a gown when a machine could handle the basic seams in an afternoon? This didn't mean couture houses abandoned artistry. Far from it. Instead, many began blending machine speed with hand-finished luxury. A dress might have its structural stitching done on a sewing machine, but its intricate beadwork, embroidery and finishing touches would still be handled by skilled hands. Think of it as the haute couture equivalent of buying pre-chopped onions, but still insisting on simmering the sauce yourself. Others, however, were scandalized. To them, the sewing machine was a threat to the very soul of fashion. Charles Frederick Worth, the so-called father of haute couture, didn't reject the machine outright, but he was famously picky about where it fit into his process. In his eyes, a couture piece wasn't just about the garment itself, it was about the hours of human attention poured into it. To mass-produce any part of it was, to some purists, like replacing a hand-painted portrait with a color photocopy, but machines had one undeniable advantage. They could make fashion faster and cheaper. This created a chasm between two worlds, bespoke tailoring for the elite, and mass-market ready-to-wear for the growing middle class. For centuries, if you wanted new clothes, you either sewed them yourself or hired a tailor. Now, department stores and catalogues could offer the latest styles to customers who might never set foot in Paris. By the late 1800s, machine-made garments were being shipped across oceans, carrying European styles into the wardrobes of Americans, Australians, and beyond. The world's fashion capitals weren't just Paris and London anymore. They were wherever the latest shipment of dresses happened to land. Of course, mass-market fashion and couture didn't just live in parallel. They competed. The sewing machine allowed skilled home seamstresses to copy high-end designs, sometimes with shocking accuracy. A pattern in a magazine, a few yards of fabric, and suddenly your neighbor was wearing something suspiciously similar to the gown you'd paid a small fortune for. Couture houses started responding with design elements that were difficult to replicate by machine alone. Delicate lacework, complex pleating, and embellishments that could only be done by hand. It became a game of cat and mouse. Couture innovated, mass market imitated, and couture innovated again. This tension also changed the economics of fashion. Before the sewing machine, a couture gown could be justified as a rare, almost timeless investment. But when fashion could be produced and sold at industrial speed, styles began changing faster. The idea of seasonal trends, now an unquestioned part of the fashion world, was turbocharged by the ability to churn out new looks in weeks rather than months. And if you think fast fashion is a 21st century invention, remember that Parisian fashion houses in the 1890s were already complaining about knockoff designs flooding markets before their own season's collections had even wrapped. Not all designers saw the machine as a threat, though. Jeanne Pacorn, one of the early female powerhouses in Paris fashion, embraced the sewing machine's efficiency while maintaining her commitment to artistry. She used machines to free up time for her seamstresses to focus on delicate finishing, turning her ateliers into sleek modern production spaces without sacrificing her reputation for luxury. To her, the sewing machine wasn't replacing skill, it was a tool that elevated it. The cultural symbolism of machine versus hand stitching ran deep. For some customers, machine sewing meant progress, a garment of the modern world, sleek and efficient. For others, it meant cheapness, a lack of the personal touch. Couture, as an industry, leaned heavily into marketing the romance of handwork. The image of a seamstress bent over a gown in a sunlit Parisian atelier became part of the couture brand, even if somewhere in the back room a sewing machine was quietly humming away. By the early 20th century, the two approaches had settled into an uneasy coexistence. Couture remained the aspirational pinnacle, handmade where it mattered, machine-made where it didn't. The mass market thrived on the machine's speed, while couture thrived on its exclusivity, and fashion, fickle, fast-moving, and ever conscious of appearances, learned to walk the tightrope between tradition and technology. The funny thing is, in the long run, the sewing machine didn't kill couture at all. If anything, it made it more precious. When everyone could own a dress, the true luxury became owning one that no one else had. As the decades rolled on, designers would continue to swear by hand stitching for some details and swear at it when deadlines loomed. After all, the sewing machine might have been a mechanical marvel, but in the world of high fashion, it was always going to be just one more tool in the hands of a very human designer. In the early days of the sewing machine, speed was determined by how quickly you could pump a treadle with your foot and how long before your calf muscles begged for mercy. This wasn't just a quaint detail, it was the reality of millions of homes and factories. The treadle-powered sewing machine was a marvel of its time, a self-contained power plant running entirely on human effort. If you wanted a hem, you pedaled. If you wanted a suit, you pedaled a lot. And if you wanted to work through the night, well, you pedaled until your neighbors asked if you were training for the Tour de France. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, small electric motors began creeping into sewing rooms. At first, these motors were clunky bolt-on attachments, basically a little whirring box that replaced your right foot with a switch. But the moment electricity got involved, sewing left the gym and entered the age of automation. Suddenly, sewing didn't require rhythmic leg workouts, it required finger coordination, and perhaps more importantly, access to an electrical outlet. The shift from treadle to electric was a quiet revolution. Factories embraced it first because speed meant profit. For home sewers, it was equally transformative. With a press of a knee lever or a flick of a foot pedal, you could sew more stitches in less time than ever before, and without the same physical exhaustion. Sure, you could still accidentally sew your sleeve to your pant leg if you weren't paying attention, but at least you weren't gasping for breath while doing it. Then came the mid-20th century, and with it, the dawn of the sewing machine as a sleek, futuristic household appliance. Streamlined designs, built-in lights and zigzag stitching patterns turned these once purely functional tools into something aspirational. The sewing machine wasn't just a workhorse, it was a status symbol, much like a refrigerator or a television. Some machines even came in pastel shades, because apparently nothing said cutting-edge technology in the 1950s quite like a mint green bobbin winder. But the real leap forward didn't happen until the late 20th century, when microprocessors joined the party. By the 1980s and 1990s, computerized sewing machines were hitting the market, boasting features that would have made Elias Howe and Isaac Singer blink in disbelief. These machines could remember stitch patterns, automatically adjust tension, and even stop with the needle in the up or down position at the touch of a button. To anyone raised on a mechanical treadle, it was like going from a bicycle to a self-driving car. And it didn't stop there. Today's high-end sewing machines come loaded with features that sound more like smartphone specs than textile tools. Touchscreens, USB ports, built-in embroidery software, and even Wi-Fi connectivity. You can download a floral design from the internet in the morning and have it stitched onto a jacket by lunch. No tracing, no guesswork, no sore hands. Some machines will thread the needle for you, cut the thread automatically, and yes, play a little tune while doing it. We've officially reached the point where your sewing machine might be smarter than your toaster. Yet, for all this dazzling technology, the sewing machine's core purpose hasn't changed. it's still about joining two pieces of fabric quickly, securely, and neatly. Even in an era dominated by fast fashion and outsourced garment production, the sewing machine remains vital. Tailors still rely on them for alterations, hobbyists use them for quilting and crafting, and small designers turn to them to create unique pieces that stand out in a sea of mass-produced clothing. There's also a growing maker movement that's brought the sewing machine full circle, back into the hands of individuals who see sewing as a skill, a statement, and a way to opt out of disposable fashion. While 19th century seamstresses might have used the machine for survival, 21st century sewists often use it for self-expression, sustainability, and occasionally, making a Halloween costume 5 hours before the party starts. What's fascinating is how the sewing machine has kept pace with our changing relationship to clothing. In the treadle era, it was about endurance. In the electric era, it was about efficiency. In the computerized era, it's about precision and creativity. And if the current pace of innovation is any indication, the next leap might involve AI-assisted design, 3D printed textiles, or machines that can sew an entire garment without a single human hand involved. Though at that point, they might start asking for weekends off. The funny thing, no matter how advanced they get, sewing machines still inspire the same mix of awe and mild terror, whether you're staring at a Victorian treadle or a $15,000 embroidery monster with a color touchscreen. The process still involves sharp needles moving at alarming speeds just millimeters from your fingers. The modern promise might be that the machine will do the work for you, but any seasoned sewer knows, one wrong move, and it will gleefully sew your project and possibly your sleeve into an unplanned avant-garde creation. So yes, we've gone from foot pedals to machines that can sew your initials while playing a lullaby. We've traded sweat for microchips and treadles for touchscreens. But at its heart, the sewing machine is still the same ingenious gadget that forever changed how we make, mend, and imagine our clothes. Only now, it might also try to sell you embroidery patterns through its built-in Wi-Fi. Progress.